And the Oscar goes to
I've got to win this one. I bribed everyone in Hollywood.
George C. Scott in Man Getting Hit by Football.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpsons fans, brought to you by ThatShelf.com. Each week, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally saw it, we realized, oh, hey, that's where that Simpsons joke came from. Regardless, each week we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I am your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me as always is the Billy Crystal to my troubling film parody montage, my co-host, Nate Storing. How you doing tonight, bud?
I'm good. Had a great night last night, actually.
Yeah.
This was a really wonderful Oscar night, and really made me appreciate the year in movies that we've had.
Yeah, I mean, so in case it wasn't obvious, which it should be, but we're trying something a little bit different this week. We're gonna be we're sort of putting out a episode in between our regularly scheduled programming because we wanted to talk about the Oscars. And unlike all the other film podcasts that put their episode out before the Oscars so that they can sort of like put in their predictions and everything, we wanted to do ours afterwards because, you know, that's just the way we are.
We don't like taking risks here.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we're not like your other two white guys talking about movies podcasts. In the same way, I don't know if people are so totally aware of this, but we edit this show quite a lot, in fact. And as such, since we don't want this episode to end up being as long as an Oscars telecast, we're also trying something a little bit different in that I'm going to set a 90-minute timer, and we're going to try and keep our conversation snappy and within 90 minutes, and I have zero confidence that we actually will be able to do this, but it'll be an interesting experiment. So, yeah, but before we sort of dig into the show itself, and before I actually officially start the timer, Nate, like, what is your history with the Oscars? Like, do you have any particular traditions? Have you been watching forever? Like, where do you stand as an Oscar fan?
Yeah, so I actually asked my parents about this because I couldn't remember as a kid, and I was trying to go back through the Oscar years and be like, okay, which hosts do I remember? And
right.
I think what I homed in on is I did not really watch the Oscars as a kid. I asked my parents. Apparently, my parents did when before I was born because my mom was the entertainment editor for the newspaper.
Right, so she would have had to.
Right, but then after I was born, we basically didn't. And I don't think that I started watching the Oscars until I met you.
Oh, interesting. Oh, so I'm a horrible influence on you.
Yeah, exactly. It's all your fault. No. I mean, I think it was early high school because I think the first year I remember was a Steve Martin year.
Okay.
After, but I don't remember Whoopi Goldberg. So I think it was the second Steve Martin year.
Right.
Which was like whatever, early 2000s. So that's like my first Oscar memory. But then my wife is actually really big on the Oscars, and it's a huge thing in her family. And so they watched it every year, and she's watched it as long as she can remember. So it's like I started watching in high school, and now it's like a big part of our family culture. And what we like to do tradition-wise is every year we make a huge tray of nachos and margaritas. Yep. And we just like pick at it for the first like hour or so of the Oscars, and typically get pretty drunk, I have to admit, watching the Oscars because those margaritas will get you.
Yeah, you sent me a picture, which I'll put in the artwork right now if you're listening in a superior podcasting application. And I think it was about an hour into the show, your wife texted me something related to the show, and she's like, "Oh, by the way, I'm incredibly drunk right now. Nate makes a really potent margarita." So I was aware of the fact that you guys were blasted, and it was like 8:00.
Yes. I usually try to I sober up by the end of the night. It's usually a long show. Yeah. So it's like I hydrate and snack and then I'm good. But that first hour, I feel like, you know, the margarita gets you.
In previous years, you needed to be a little more sauced for those early hours because it can sometimes they can be a bit of a slog.
What about you?
No, in my case, it's funny because when we sort of initially doing our pre-research, pre-discussion, I was saying I honestly, like, it's one of those things where I kind of don't remember not watching the Oscars. Obviously, I didn't as a small child, but I said, when I was a little kid, I wasn't obviously watching the whole telecast. I think I do remember watching, Billy Crystal would do his opening monologue where he'd edit himself into the movies, and I'd always find that funny. And then he'd do like a song and dance, and I'd find that funny. And then I'd probably have to go to bed. But the first year that I remember actually sort of being engaged in the Oscars was the American Beauty year, because I remember being, and I was in the 6th grade, and I remember the next day in class, because I couldn't stay up late to finish the show, because again, this was when the show was wrapping at like 11:30 at night or whatever. So I remember that morning in grade 6 French class asking our teacher, like, so what won Best Picture? And she was like, American Beauty. And like the whole class was like, what the hell is that movie? And of course, it wouldn't be for another, 5 years or whatever until I would see that movie.
You're a little young for that one.
A little bit. When you're like 12, I guess I probably was. And not only was I too young, I just like wouldn't, even if I had seen it, I wouldn't have been interested in that at all. Like I don't
still
remember
what. In fact,
well, yeah, there's something to be said for that too. But I think from that point on, like every year I watched, and then as I sort of got older and older, I strove to try and see as many of the Oscar-nominated films as possible. And in those early days in high school, like that was tricky because, we lived in not a small city, but like we had a Cineplex. And if your movie was more art house inclined, like getting to be able to see it without being in Toronto was next to impossible.
You'd have to go to the Princess, which was easier for me than for you.
Much easier for you. Or in some cases, once it won the Oscar, it might then sort of go into a bit more of a wide release. But that was also in my sort of peak piracy years, and very much took advantage of the leaked screeners. I'm telling on myself, but I did. I watched a lot of screeners back then, and sort of into university as well. And then, but yeah, once we moved to Toronto, it became a lot easier to actually go and see all. At least I would do the Best Pictures until that one year where they added 10, and then from that point on, it became very difficult to see everything. But
that's about the same for me. I do try to see all of them, but I'm also not like zealous about it.
Right.
This year I think is the first year in a while that I've seen all 10. And I think it was a fantastic year, so that was part of it, is just like everything in that top 10 I think is worth seeing. Whereas other years it's kind of like, well, maybe they're reaching a little bit here.
It's funny because I remember that year that they first did the 10, and it really, I think that was like 2007, I want to say. And it really was 2007, 2008, and it really was a truly phenomenal. It was like, these are you couldn't pick just 5 because we had such a killer year. And I remember that was one of those years where I think I did see all of them, if not close to all of them, and really was going into it being like, this is hard to pick. And then immediately following the next year, I was like, there are not 10 movies that need to be on here. And, that's when we start to get into I'll never forget the year The King's Speech won Best Picture over Toy Story 3. And I was livid. And of course, everybody thought that I would be team The Social Network. But no, I was rooting for Toy Story 3, which I still maintain is like, it should have won Best Picture, not just Best Animated Feature, but Best Picture. It was the best picture of that year.
Interesting.
But yeah, ever since then, I've really wished they would go back to only 5 or like maybe 7, like split the difference. But I think you're right in that this year, that it definitely was a very, very solid 10.
Well, and it's like there are movies like Barbie, for example, that like may not have been in the 5. Because I mean, and not necessarily for good reason, in my opinion. But
we're going to get into that, I think. But
yes, of course. But like when you look at what else it was nominated for, it might not have been in that 5, and so it's like it's just one of those things. It feels like it really is very year to year. I wish they had a little bit more leeway to say like it's 5 to 10.
Yeah, exactly.
That probably would reflect reality better. But I'm sure that's difficult.
Now that we've sort of done our preamble, I'm going to hit start on our timer, and there's no commercial breaks, but Jimmy Kimmel will now come out and do his opening monologue. So the timer has now begun, and it's counting down.
All right. Adam, what did you think about the Oscars? What I mean, yeah, I thought this was a really strong showing, in my opinion. I mean, overall I was very, very impressed, and just a huge step up over the last several years, in my opinion. But what did you think?
Yeah, I have to be honest with you. The last couple years of the Oscars, and I don't know if it was because of what my job was, and I was just sort of burned out on award season and just like caring too much about all of this stuff. But for the last couple years, I was kind of soured on the Oscars. I really, there was that pandemic year, which was at least an interesting year, and I kind of thought, well, this is kind of fun and different, the infamous Soderbergh year. And then there was the year where they cut a bunch of the technical awards from the telecast, and I boycott. I mean, and it clearly my boycott.
The slap year.
Yeah, so I missed the slap, but it was also just sort of, I felt like the movies that I really cared about weren't really making too much of an awards play. So I was just, I had really sort of fallen out of love with the Oscars. And I think the biggest thing for me was that the Oscars over the last couple years, as they were chasing sort of notoriety, chasing eyeballs, chasing a younger generation maybe, they became less and less about the movies and the awards and more about bits and overly long montages and like what sort of fun thing can we do to, it's in a weird way. I think they were always, ever since the Moonlight La La Land moment, every year they were kind of chasing, how do we create a moment that will be talked about like that moment was? And I think it just never really worked, and it moved further and further away from what I loved, which was celebrating movies and the people who make them. And the thing I got to say about last night was that I think for the first time in close to a decade, that's what it was. Like, there was very few bits. There was no, I made this joke multiple times, but there was no Cirque du Soleil tribute to the movies, which is a very real thing that happened one year. And but that was the stuff that drove me nuts, because I'd be like, you're setting aside 15 minutes of the show for this thing that's like tertially related to the movies. And now when this guy wins his award on the biggest night of his life, he's going to get 20 seconds to make a speech and then you're going to play him off. Like, that's unacceptable. And this year, I mean, I think they maybe played the playoff music like 3 or 4 times, which is nothing. And it didn't seem like anybody had their mics cut off. Like, everybody got to say what they wanted to say and celebrate what they wanted to celebrate. And so I truly think this is one of the best telecasts in recent memory.
Yeah, I think that it shows a lot of confidence. I feel like that's the thing in the last few years that's been missing, is they just they felt more and more desperate, just trying to find some way to get people excited again. And this felt like it was a very back to basics year of it. It really just is about the awards. It's about the people who are receiving the awards. It's about movies, and there just isn't a lot of bullshit. I mean, so I think that was very successful because, honestly, one of the big things, they came in way under time compared to other years, right?
Yes,
which seems like a little thing. But like, I do think it matters that it's like, it was a tight show. They started an hour early, which confused the shit out of a lot of people,
including me. I literally was putting my son to bed, and someone sent me a message being like, "That was a great opening montage," and I was like, "It started at 7 o'clock," and I was like, "Oh shit!" And I said to me,
imagine the people on the West Coast who it's like 4 p.m. and it's already starting, right? But yeah,
I was a little caught off guard, but yeah, it ended early, which I don't think has ever in the history of the Oscars happened. Like, it was
maybe in like the 1920s.
Yeah, but it was kind of nice. Like, it wrapped, and I wasn't like, I didn't want to go to bed. Like, I think there was one year recently where it got to about like 11 o'clock or whatever, and I was like, I'm turning in. Like, I don't even care at this point. Like, I actually, you know what it was? It was the Soderbergh year. I didn't make it to the end. So the big, the big twist ending with where they thought Chadwick Boseman was going to win Best Actor, and then it ended up being Anthony Hopkins, who wasn't even there. Like, I missed the whole thing. Didn't know that happened. I have a bad history in recent years of missing out on the big surprises, but no, it was, and I guess actually let's maybe talk about Jimmy, our host. What did you think of Kimmel? How do you think he did?
So One of our colleagues at That Shelf, Dakota Arsenault, who has the Contra Zoom podcast, he described Kimmel as a perfectly cromulent host, which I think is about right? Like, I mean, he is. I don't love Jimmy Kimmel. I think he's fine. You know, I've never watched his show. I just don't like him that much. But I think he did a good job last night. I think that he hit way more than he missed. I think that, again, he kept things tight. He kept things moving. There wasn't a lot of fat to cut in terms of just like, you know, like you said, bits that just kind of go off in some direction. Like, it was a very tight show. And so, I mean, I thought he did a great job, actually. What about you?
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. Kimmel's never been one of my guys. I mean, as people who know me well know, like I'm Team Seth Meyers. That's my late night program. Sure. But Kimmel, you know, like I think he's a decent enough host. To be honest, like, I guess maybe I'm showing my age, but like, I've always been a Billy Crystal fan, and I remember that one year where I think it was the year that Anne Hathaway and what's his name? The
James
guy
Franco.
James Franco, when they were hosting, and like halfway through the show,
that year was the low. That was like the low point of all of the Oscars. That was depressing.
And halfway through the show, Billy Crystal came out to present an award, and the audience erupted because it was as if they were saying, Billy, please save us. Please just take over from this point. Like, is this what the producers have done? Have they called him, and has he thrown on a tux, and he's here to, like, and sadly he did not.
He was in the bath like an hour ago, and they were just like, Billy, we need you. You got to save this show.
We're desperate. And actually, I think a year or two later, they did actually bring him back, and like a little bit of the magic was gone.
Also, I think I have to say, like, that was the year where he looked like Tintin in the opening montage, and it was very, very creepy. Yeah.
So, but I think finding the right host is difficult, and like there were a couple years where it was hostless, which I didn't really fully understand, because at the end of the day, the host is just there to sort of do an opening monologue and then a bunch of interstitials, and if they've done their, like, that's why I think Billy was traditionally a quite good choice. But I thought Kimmel did a really good job. I agree, like, most of his jokes landed. Some of them that didn't, it was like you kind of knew they weren't going to land. And I appreciated that he acknowledged some of the elephants in the room. Like, he talked about the fact that Barbie was lacking in certain nominations that it probably shouldn't have been. He acknowledged the strikes, and I thought that moment at the end of his monologue where he brought the sort of behind the scenes crew out and they got a standing ovation from the audience, like, I thought that was a really nice way to acknowledge what the past few months in the industry has been like, and sort of not shy away from that. So
I also like that he called out the Directors Guild.
Yes, that was funny too. But that's what I mean. Like, he just, and he's kind of got that abrasive yet loving sort of you know, he's not like Ricky Gervais where he's like, I'm just gonna be an asshole and that's my shtick. But like, Kimmel's got enough edge that he can sort of throw a barb, but it comes off sort of like lovingly like that. So
exactly.
Again, I don't know that I would necessarily, he would be my number one pick, but compared to some of the previous hosts we've had in the last few years, or at least the last decade, I think he's probably top of the list. So,
well, and I think the thing is too that this show is so highly produced that I think that there are probably people that you'd be like, yeah, they'd be a great host, but they won't have the freedom to actually like do their thing or be themselves, right? Like, you know, at one point they had Mulaney come on, right? And John Mulaney was doing a great bit.
Easily my favorite part of the night was Mulaney's whole run on Field of Dreams. My sides hurt from laughing.
Yeah, and I turned to my wife and I was like, you know, well, John Mulaney would be a great host. But the thing is that if John Mulaney were in Jimmy Kimmel's position, he would not be allowed to do the shtick, right? Like, it would be highly scripted, highly rehearsed, and I think you'd lose. Like, he had that small contained moment to do the John Mulaney thing, and I think they let him do that, but like, they wouldn't let him do that for a whole show. So like, you need someone like a Jimmy Kimmel,
or they would let Mulaney do it and it would be a 12-hour episode. Like, it would just because that's the way it would be. But no, exactly. And that's where I think you need sort of a seasoned kind of like late night kind of
Yes.
person who's used to sort of doing that thing, moving a show along and understanding how to work within the time constraints. And so it makes sense that it would be someone like that. It's why I think someone like Neil Patrick Harris, who I think is a phenomenal Tony's host, is not a great Oscars host, because he just doesn't.
Right.
He lacks that ability to keep things moving in a way that television requires. So,
Yeah.
I would give him, a solid B+, A-, maybe.
Yeah, I think A- for me. I mean, I think, again, like, compared to the last few years, I think it's head and shoulders above, like, as long as I can remember, almost, with the Oscars.
Right.
So that's pretty damn good. What about just some of the moments? I mean, like, one of the things that stuck out to me this year was I thought the cinematography was really good, which is not something that I usually like think about with the Oscars, right? But there were a few moments that were really creative, particularly I think in the musical numbers, where like you have Billie Eilish coming on, and you're seeing from backstage looking out at the audience, and she's facing you, right? Like that moment, or even just the close-ups of John Baptiste during his number that were really, really close, felt out of character with the Oscars, I guess, because it's a live show, so I feel like typically they go quite safe with their shots, but like they were doing some interesting stuff this year.
Yeah, I think I one of my notes just on the whole was I felt the overall look and feel was really, really nice, really elevated. I again, the Soderbergh year, he shot the show in scope, which was an interesting choice. It was in that like LA train station or whatever, so it didn't have the regular look and feel of an award show, because it was supposed to acknowledge that like this is a weird year. So that year was weird and looked cool, but this year was like, it looked like a proper awards show, but it was really beautifully production designed. I loved how they used sort of all the sort of screens that were built into the sets, and the use of light and color and just overall design. I'm always a fan of how they do sort of their motion bumpers. This year, I felt they were kind of pedestrian. There's been other years where they've been like really, really beautiful motion design and just like a look and feel to those sort of packaging elements. But I think in terms of the overall production design of the set and like you say, and then how they shot the set and all of that was really beautiful and in a way I again just wasn't expecting. I felt that they really sort of brought things up a notch from previous years.
Well, I mean, like one of the, since you mentioned the motion graphics, one of the things that I feel like I noticed this year that probably contributes to how short it was is that there weren't a lot of clips, right?
No.
They only showed the best pictures basically as interstitials between awards. And I don't think they showed any clips for any of the specific nominees, which again, like probably saved them a ton of time, but also like, is that,
there was for the screenplay awards. They would do the sort of like dialogue and then they'd type out the dialogue. But I think you're right. Like, in terms of all the technical stuff. Well, actually, no, the sound. I remember the sound one had a really cool sort of shtick, essentially, where they would show a scene from the movie that had no dialogue or music, so you were really just hearing the sound design, which I thought was a really nice touch. But yeah, they were like, it was definitely light on clips. I mean, the biggest thing being that they didn't have, for all of the acting awards, they opted for this format that they've done in the past, but I think is a really, really strong format that I actually prefer to seeing the clips, which is having past winners come out and sort of congratulate and introduce each of the nominees. And I think this year, we got to see some absolute legends on stage. And I remember I texted you when Jamie Lee Curtis said like, I'm going to talk about my best friend, Jodie Foster. And I was just like, can you imagine if your best friend was Jodie Foster and or Jamie Lee Curtis? Like what that must be like. It's crazy. But again, it's seeing these people who, we think of them as celebrities, but they think of each other as colleagues or compatriots or fellow professionals.
Peers.
And peers. That's the word I was really searching for. And when you get to see them sort of talk about their craft and the admiration for each other's craft, I always sort of appreciate that and they managed to toe that line of it being genuine and not sort of navel-gazy, because I think that you can it's very easy to tip over into that territory of like making it seem like, you know, you're saving the world when you're just making a movie. But I really liked that format this year.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I found myself, you know, because it's like they start off with Best Supporting Actress, and I thought that was a particularly strong version of that, because most of the presenters did actually know the nominees and were able to speak to them on a personal level. And I was really tearing up when by the time that Davine Joy Randolph was up on stage, because I was just thinking to myself, like, imagine winning that award and getting up on that stage with those 5 amazing actresses. I mean, it just must be an incredible experience. And like, you know, I can't think of the last time that I've sort of teared up watching the Oscars, you know. But I think that format really gets at that.
There was a moment for me when she won that I was really struck by, which is the camera cut to Jodie Foster. And, you know, they've done this in the past where someone wins and you cut to the other people who don't win and they're politely applauding. But you can tell, like, I don't know if you watch Friends, but there's a famous joke about Joey, you know, is supposed to do the polite applaud and nod, and he's like freaking out or whatever. And, but they cut to Jodie Foster, and she is just absolutely beaming, because this is a person who, like, she's had her flowers. She doesn't like, at this point, she probably doesn't care. You know, she's just an honor to be nominated or whatever. And she's seeing this up and coming actor win this award, win this plaudits, and sees how much it means to them. And she's just, you know, she's beaming with pride for the, you know, sort of next generation. And I, you know, again, that's what this show is about for me. That's what I love is moments like that, and less so the, you know, the sort of bits and stuff like that.
Well, what about some of these other things? I mean, obviously, I feel like one of the moments that everyone was waiting for was "I'm Just Ken," right? Much, you know, everyone was sort of speculating of like whether or not it would happen, how it would happen, what, you know, do you feel like it lived up to the hype of like what people were expecting that to be?
I'm just kidding. Anywhere else I'd be. Is it my destiny to live a life of love
I know this is the basic answer, but I 100% did. Like, I loved it. You know, it's the musical theater fan in me found that very entertaining. I thought it understood what it was, and they took it to the next level. Like, I mean, they had Slash show up. Like, they understood this is sort of a novelty song. Like, everybody knows it's not going to win, but as much as I wanted it to win, I knew it wasn't going to win, but
yeah, me too.
I love Mark Ronson, so I really want him to get an Oscar, but I also just love the idea of like, can the novelty song from this comedy win best pick or win best original song? But as you know, talking about camera work, like they were doing the sort of Busby Berkeley like overhead shots.
Yeah,
again, they brought out this huge crowd of people. They had people singing along. Like, I loved when he ran into the audience and had Margot Robbie and Greta Gerwig singing along.
Yeah, they were so excited.
Yeah, it was just, again, it was sort of a breath of fresh air. It was like, they were doing a bit, but the bit happened to be in line with the fact that this song was nominated, so it had every right to do a bit. And that's what I appreciate is like, you're making space for this silly number to get its due, and I think they did such a great job with it. And I mean, Ryan Gosling, man, like it's unfair that someone that
so talented,
hot can be that talented and funny. Like, it's really like it shouldn't be allowed, but he did such a great job. And like, again, you can tell that the guy doesn't take himself too seriously, which I think goes a long way.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, overall, I was very happy. And again, like, Ryan Gosling killed it in terms of his performance, the tone of it. I mean, some of those moments with the sort of the overhead shot with like all the Barbie faces and stuff.
Yeah.
Like, that was so cool. I mean, honestly, I think it was so built up in my head that I was maybe slightly disappointed, but that's not really fair. That's
Right.
not really fair. But I was almost like, like what if you had all of the supporting and leading actors out on stage? What if you had,
Right.
like all of those, like it could have been this huge thing, but like, no, I mean, it makes sense that it was what it was. At various points we were texting back and forth during the night, just being like, imagine how hard this is to pull together logistically.
Yeah.
Even just getting those 5 actors or those 5 actresses on the stage together to present those awards is a tremendous feat of organization. And I just can't even imagine, like getting all of those actors up on stage to be part of a musical number like that, getting them to rehearse it, et cetera, et cetera. So, all that said, I think it was pretty tremendous. And yeah, I mean, just really, again, captures the magic of this year in movies, and what a cultural phenomenon that movie was.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I remember, like, I knew about that song in advance, and I remember when I saw, granted, I saw Barbie under less than ideal circumstances because I saw it in the drive-in. But I sort of, like, I kind of, that's how I felt seeing the number in the context of the film. I was just kind of underwhelmed by it. I was like, oh, okay, like this is the thing that everybody's talking about. So I had sort of the opposite reaction of like, I got the experience that I wanted from the seeing it in the film. I got it last night watching it at the award show. So
Interesting.
But yeah, I think it will be talked about for many years to come, and I am absolutely certain that next year there will be someone who tries to replicate it in a search for award or in a search for ratings, and it will probably fall flat. But who knows? Maybe we'll get lucky.
Very possible. Very possible.
Speaking of like the other one of the few bits they did last night that I actually really, really enjoyed was the John Cena streaker moment.
Oh, that was funny. Yes. Being
Being an Oscar nerd, when Jimmy Kimmel came out and said like, this is the 50th anniversary of, and I was like, what is he going to say? And then I was like, oh my God, it's either going to be one of two things. And this might have happened on the same night. I think what happened, so I knew about the streaker thing, but then something happened where I think the streaker happens and David Niven is like aghast. And then another actor like tap danced across the stage and stole one of the statues and just left. But then I might be conflating two different like events that happened. But I remember that is something that like during one of the shows, one of the actors who is not a winner basically like tap danced and grabbed a statue and ran off with it. So anyway, I had a sense of where it was going. And then when they said the streaker thing, but I didn't know, I was like, okay, well, who's it going to be? I was assuming maybe it was going to be Ryan Gosling because like, and they were going to do some Ken joke and like he's all smooth down there or something. I was not expecting the John Cena of it all, but
he was perfect. John Cena's a great comedic actor. He's very, very funny. Yeah, I thought that really worked. The Octavia Spencer, Melissa McCarthy bit, on the other hand, that was a low point for me.
Yes.
It just really didn't work. You could tell it didn't work in the room really either. It was kind of falling flat, but...
Oh, I was just going to say, it was unclear if it was improvised or not, like, or was it written for them to sort of be like that? Like,
I think it was written, which is even worse.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that was when I was sort of like getting frustrated because I'm pretty sure that if I'm not mistaken, that was one of the first times in the evening that where the award winners actually did get played off, and I was like, oh cool, so they got to do their dumb joke that didn't work, but the people who won their award don't get enough time to say what they want to say, and that feels kind of shitty. So
but I mean, it's like, again, when you think about past years, it's like I can remember years where that was the tone of the whole show.
Well, exactly.
So it's like, thank God that it was contained. Yeah.
I mean, to only have one sort of truly, to have one bit that bombed and the rest sort of went off without a hitch. And again, arguably were some of the funniest. I think I would say that this has been the funniest the Oscars has been in a long time. Between the streaker thing, I'm Just Ken, and then the Mulaney. And actually, the other one that I thought was really great was when DeVito and Schwarzenegger came out, and they had their whole like riff on Batman, and then they cut to Keaton in the audience, and he was like, he looked like Bruce Wayne sitting in the like.
Yeah, his little finger gesture.
Yeah. Or
that
when
was fun.
Kate McKinnon did the whole like Jurassic Park isn't a documentary. Who have I been sending my tasteful nudes to? And then they cut to Steven Spielberg and he plays
perfect
along
comedic
like
timing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like who would have thought that 70-something-year-old Steven Spielberg would still have it? But yeah, so there were all the gags kind of landed apart from that McCarthy and Spencer bit, which is a bummer, but I guess they can't all be winners. So
yeah, for sure. Well, so next year we know that there's going to be a new casting category, but one of the weirder moments of the show for me this year was this moment where they come out and they introduced a stunt montage, right? And we got a clip show of all sorts of great stunts from throughout the year. But then at the end they're like, "Thanks, guys. We love stunt people."
Yeah, which again, that part is deserved. I'm glad that they're acknowledging it, but it just felt
for sure.
It was like, okay, to what end? Like, was it? And you actually texted me something that I thought was brilliant,
which was basically like, well, what if they just shadow dropped that as a category, right? Like, you want ratings? That would get you ratings. Is to like just keep that on the hush hush and then be like, surprise, we now have a new stunt category. There was like a part of me watching that I was like, would they possibly? But I just don't think that. I think they're too conservative an organization to do something like that. But there was a moment where I was like, maybe they're going to do it, and then in the end, it was very anticlimactic, unfortunately. But I feel like it was a response to just like the online discourse around this, where there's like more and more people being like, there should be a stunt category. It's like, for exactly the reasons that they set it up. It's like, so many of the early film pioneers were also stunt people, and stunts have always been part of the medium. In fact, because movies are like a magic trick. They started as like a magic trick, and so stunts it makes sense as like a sister medium to that. And so it was just funny that they basically made the case for why there should be a category, and then totally just dropped the ball in terms of like the ending of that. So I don't know, but maybe they're testing the messaging. Like I couldn't quite figure out what that was all about.
Were there any speeches that sort of stood out to you as being particularly strong or particularly weak or because I think that's the thing that we always end up coming away talking about is talking about the bits and then talking about the really, really great speeches.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that there were a lot of really nice speeches throughout. I mean, nothing really jumps out to me as, like a world-changing sort of speech, one of those ones that you'll hear forever in montages and that kind of thing moving forward. But I thought there were a lot of really, really nice moments. One of the ones that kind of stands out to me is just Robert Downey Jr. finally getting his flowers and starting off his speech by saying, "I'd like to thank my terrible childhood." Which definitely made me laugh. But also it is also this kind of knowing thing where he's like owning all of his history, right?
Yep.
And baggage, which is pretty beautiful in a moment like that for someone who's like had such a complicated long career to be where he was last night and to be able to really own that is actually a very cool thing. But what about you? What were there any moments for you that stood out?
Yeah, I actually took some. I was transcribing some of the lines that stood out to me. The first winner of the night, Divine Joy Randolph. She had a lovely sort of sentiment to hers because she was basically saying she was ready to give up and she didn't want to be an actor to begin with and all this stuff. And she had this incredible support system along the way. And she said the line that sort of stood out to me was, "For so long I thought I needed to be different, but now I know I just needed to be myself." And of course, for anyone who feels, like, what they're doing may not be the right thing or is from a marginalized community, which obviously like she is. I think hearing something like that and seeing that on a world stage is so incredibly powerful. And for it to be the very first speech of the night, like it really kind of set the right tone for the rest of the evening. I thought Jonathan Glazer's speech was really powerful when he sort of acknowledged the ongoing situation in Gaza and Israel. I loved the fact that the editor had one of the shortest speeches of the night, because leave it to the editor to know to keep it snappy. With the irony being that the film she cut was maybe not super, in some people's mind, was not super snappy. And then when the documentary feature team won for their film about the crisis in Ukraine, again, I thought there were some really beautiful lines, in particularly, we cannot change the history, we cannot change the past, but we can make sure that the history record is set straight. Cinema forms memories, memories form history. Which again is like, at the risk of the Oscars starting to, like, you know, again, be too navel-gazy or whatever, at least in this case, this is not a fictional film. Like, this is it's a documentary about a very serious situation going on in our world right now. And, you know, again, I do agree. I think there's that long-standing, you know, the Vietnam War was lost because it was the first war fought on television, right? Like, imagery has power. And at the end of the day, we are a society that kind of has a tendency to not care about history, but in a weird way, unless we see it in popular entertainment. And so he's right. I think cinema really does define history in many ways and will rewrite history. So it's important for filmmakers to do the right thing and to capture things and tell the right stories. And so I found that moment particularly powerful. The last thing I wanted to discuss is, before we get into sort of the tucking into things in a little more in depth, I just wanted to ask about how you thought the finale went. The big climactic end,
Pacino.
Best Picture.
Al
Hooah!
Pacino.
Al Pacino comes out, and I have to say, when they said, you know, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of The Godfather Part 2, I was like, oh, are they going to get Coppola to, like, present? Which I was so
That's
stoked
what
for.
I thought too.
Because, you know,
that's what I thought
Coppola's one of my
too.
guys. Love him. He's currently my favorite celebrity Instagram. So, you know, I think that's who they're teeing up. And no, it's Al Pacino, and he comes out and he looks shorter than ever. And, ooh, boy.
I mean, like, the thing that's wild about that moment is that he didn't even read the nominees. It's the biggest award of the night. And, like, I feel like, yes, you know, we want to keep things short. I get it. But also it's like, I feel like all of those movies should just get one last moment on the stage to just be recognized. Especially the ones that didn't win anything else, weren't even nominated for a lot else, right?
Absolutely. But I think he was supposed to. Someone told me that he was supposed to recap them. And that's part of why the show ended up being like 4 minutes short, was because he was supposed to read out the nominees, and then they would, like, you know, cut to the clip package or cut to the title or whatever. And so, like, that was supposed to build up a little bit of anticipation, but no, instead he just, like, opens the thing and he's like, I see Oppenheimer, hooah!
My eyes see.
Yeah, and then, of course, like, everybody in the crowd is like, okay, is this a Moonlight situation? And you could tell that he's thinking, oh, people aren't sure. And so he's like, no, really? And he, like, I see Emma Thomas, and, like, starts to read it, and then people are like, oh, shit, like, they actually did win. And so that, like, the band is like, oh, start playing the theme, start playing the theme. So, yeah, it was not...
It was abrupt.
I mean...
It was very abrupt.
Nowhere near as bad as the La La Land Moonlight fiasco, but certainly it did not go... If I were the Oppenheimer guys, I would be like, oh, well, that's not how I expected this to go. So, but, you know, it is what it is.
But also, like, you know, what about like Past Lives, for example, that was nominated for sure. Whatever, 2 or 3 things, but it was nominated for Best Picture, and it didn't even get a moment to just be like, yes, Past Lives is a great movie, you know, like,
yeah, no, for sure.
I feel a little bad for that, but overall, I mean, like, these are mostly quibbles in the grand scheme of, like, again, a show that for several years has not been my favorite thing, and I feel like they really lost their way. This did feel like they've found a new direction, that at a more confident, tighter direction that I hope they will continue and just, like, keep refining over the year. Well, Adam, I thought rather than going through every single category, we could kind of take this episode to just talk about some of our favorite movies of the year, and then talk about them, you know, at the Oscars and just how they've performed. But we don't usually get to talk about the movies that we're watching that are more contemporary. So it's a great opportunity to look back on 2023. So overall, like, what did you think of this year in movies? I mean, like I've already said, I think it's been a pretty incredible year, but what has your experience been?
I will say I didn't necessarily have that same experience this year. I don't know if it's because of what my job was and how my relationship to movies had sort of gone from being a hobby to being a career, and, watching a lot of movies. Not, also being a new parent, I don't get to go out to the movies very often. So I was seeing a lot of movies that were being preview screened for the festival, so wouldn't even necessarily get released this year or got released at the end of the year. And only, occasionally going out to the theater to see a new release. And I have to say, I was sort of hitting this point where I was going to the movies, and every time I just kind of left very disappointed and very sort of worried that I was falling out of love with film. But there was one film, and we will talk about it, but I'm not going to spoil it yet. But there was one film that when I went to see it this summer, I left rejuvenated and like, no, it's not me. It's the movies. Like they hadn't been what I had been. I finally got what I needed, and I was very, very happy. So, but I think the thing that was very, very special for me this year and was very different, and I think is probably very different for most people, was that, this is sort of the first year, full calendar year in a quote-unquote post-pandemic world where I think the theatrical experience was back. I saw most of my new releases this year in theaters. It wasn't on streaming or it wasn't an expensive rental on iTunes. I actually got to go and sit in a dark auditorium, for the most part in IMAX, because I went to most of the new releases I went and saw because they were IMAX releases. But got to see in a theater with other film fans the way that these movies are meant to be seen. And that was something that was really, really special, and that I think I didn't realize how much I missed until I kind of got back into it. And it's, I know it's sort of cliche to say it, but like I do think, as much as I can enjoy watching a movie at home, I will always enjoy a movie more because if I've gone to the theater. So I was really, really happy to be able to get back into seeing films in the cinema. How about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had a lot of really good sort of like cinematic experiences this year, I'd say, of just like being in the theater with other people. I mean, like, obviously Barbenheimer, I feel like, was a huge part of it, of just being in a packed movie theater for both of those movies, with people like wearing pink, wearing black, wearing elaborate outfits, excited to be there. Like, that was great. Like you said, I mean, I was feeling great, but it was nice to see other people falling in love with going to the movies and like, having this memorable experience that they're going to talk about, probably maybe for the rest of their lives, some of them. So I thought that was a really great experience. I also got to see Spider-Man Across the Universe in movie theaters this year, a long time ago now, it feels like. But that was also a really fantastic experience for me. Like those, I'll talk about it more, but I just feel like those movies have such a unique aesthetic that is like nothing else when you get to see it on the big screen. So those really stand out to me as those sort of like big movie theater moments. I also thought it was a really great year for comedy. And that's mostly like, I'm not, as you know, I'm not generally a big comedy person. I'm very picky about comedy is the big thing. And so a lot of the stuff that's come out even over the last like 10 or 20 years is not really my taste. Like, I don't like a lot of mainstream comedies, but I saw a lot of comedies or dramedies this year that I really, really loved. Whether you're talking about like Blackberry, I think Poor Things is kind of a comedy. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, Bottoms, American Fiction, Theater Camp, No Hard Feelings, Polite Society, and Air. Like, all of those movies are really funny movies that are way more to my taste and just kind of, I don't know what it is about them, but they're not as bit heavy, I guess. They're not just joke machines. They all have a great story, great characters, and a bit of a world to them that I think make them a little bit more than some comedies, studio comedies have been in the past. But I don't know. I mean, did you get a chance to see some of those movies, or what did you think?
Yeah, no, I've seen a few of those, not nearly as many as I maybe would have liked to have. But I think you're right in that I've never been a huge fan of the sort of Judd Apatow / Will Ferrell movement in comedies. You know, I famously am a huge fan of like Monty Python and Woody Allen's early work, like these sort of very heavily scripted, very, very funny, but like very heavily scripted comedies. And I think that's the big difference with this year's comedies. They don't feel like, you know, they just rolled the camera and was like, okay, do something funny. They felt like we have mapped out a plot, we have mapped out, you know, a scene, we have written out these really funny lines, and we can play with how we're going to deliver them or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's ironic saying that after we did a 3.5-hour episode on Spinal Tap, which is mostly improvised.
I was going to say,
that's the exception, not the rule. But yeah, no, I agree with you. If the studio comedy has kind of gone the way of the dodo in recent years, because as we sort of have discussed, it doesn't translate well overseas generally, and so they just don't really tend to make them anymore. But it's nice to see that there are these sort of what would now be considered micro budget, but you know, essentially like $10 million, $20 million comedies being made that, you know, are funny and have a lot of heart, and or in some cases, you know, like Blackberry is, you know, it's a very I wouldn't necessarily classify that movie as a comedy necessarily, but it is very, very
it's
funny.
a dramedy. It has a lot of humor in it, but it is also a dramatic story too. Yeah. Or, I mean, Poor Things, same thing.
Yeah, I would say Air is more of a straightforward comedy, although it is similarly a product origin story. But yeah, no, I think you're right. It's been a really strong year for the kinds of comedy that you and I tend to gravitate towards.
Before we dig into our top 10, I do feel like we need to acknowledge that obviously, like, we didn't see every movie this year.
Yes.
So, like, what are, you know, I mean, for me, like, some things that are still on my watch list, let's say. The Boy and the Heron. That's a big one. I feel like I really, obviously, I mean, it won Best Animated Feature, but like I really want to see that. It's just difficult to find on streaming right now. So I need to kind of find an opportunity to see it in theaters or wait. Napoleon, Naiad, Perfect Days, another one I'm really excited about.
Yeah.
The Teacher's Lounge. One that got no Oscar nominations, but I've heard so much about is All of Us Strangers.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, which feels like a lot of people feel like it maybe got a little snubbed. And then, of course, Flamin' Hot. I mean, I gotta see the origin of those Cheetos.
Yeah, that whoa boy. Yeah, I have to say, again, being what my job was, and I had to watch a lot of movies for the festival, and so I didn't necessarily get to see as many new releases as I would want to. Also, having a child at home means that I have limited opportunities to go to the theater, so I really had to pick, what am I making time for? And I think that's part of the problem was I maybe made time for the wrong films in some cases. But, a lot of these Oscar movies sort of come out generally at the tail end of the year, which is a very busy time of year. And if I didn't get to pre-screen it for TIFF, chances are I didn't see it. So, yeah, like I missed out on things like Past Lives and Napoleon, most of those animated titles. Poor Things, really feels like the biggest glaring omission for me because it ended up winning a ton of awards last night, and I couldn't go into it being like, yeah, that's deserved, or no, that's not deserved. So I felt that's one where I mean, thankfully, at least here in Canada, is now streaming on Disney Plus. So I will be able to catch up on that in the next week or two. Well, what can I say?
Just sidebar. Disney Plus is so weird outside of the United States because here it's just Disney movies.
Yeah, no, I know.
And then everywhere else it's like, oh yeah, it's got like everything.
Well, because strange. See, we don't have Hulu up here, so they just throw. Technically, it's usually under the Star banner, whatever the hell that is. But yeah, so we in Canada, like our Disney Plus is outstanding because it's Disney movies, Fox movies, and then like all these like all the Hulu stuff. It's one of it's money well spent up here. That's for sure. But and then I got to be honest with you, Nate. I know you really wanted me to, and I really, really tried. I have not finished yet Killers of the Flower Moon. I'm watching it the way Martin Scorsese intended, in 20-minute chunks in between nap times. It's it's just, that's the reality. Like, I knew it was one of those movies that I was like, if I do not see this in theaters, I'm probably not gonna get a chance to actually properly watch it. And it's a bummer because I will say, of the hour and 40 minutes that I've seen, like, it's clearly an incredibly well-crafted film. It's not my kind of film, and I've said Marty is not one of my guys. I was always more, like I alluded to earlier, Francis Ford Coppola was my sort of like 70s enfant terrible, as it were. You know, I prefer The Godfather to Goodfellas, and so. But that being said, you know, I knew that it was a very, very important movie to try and see, so I tried my best. But it just, it wasn't, I can't go into it saying that I got the full proper experience like you did. And I'm very jealous, I mean, I will say. So
it's a commitment even in theaters. So
oh, absolutely.
I get it.
Okay, well, so before we sort of tuck into our top 5, I thought it would be good if we did sort of our honorable mentions, and we can just sort of briefly talk about, you know, what didn't crack the top 5. So, and again, I have to admit that when Nate and I went through what my top 10 was, it was a little embarrassing. Just based on what I managed to see and not see. Not see. Woo, woo. But I did, and I also had to tweak it because, again, some of the things that made my top 10 were movies that haven't technically been released yet. They played the festival, so like they were what I saw in 2023 and technically were released in 2023, but haven't gone into wide release. So I had to do a little bit of rejigging, but the top 5, or sorry, my honorable mentions, you know, number 6 through 10 in descending order. Number 10 is a Canadian documentary, actually. It's called Swan Song, and it is about the National Ballet of Canada is putting on a production of Swan Lake, directed by Karen Kane, who is their outgoing artistic director. She retired this year or last year, I can't remember, but it was sort of one of those like very, very interesting you know, pulling back the curtain to get to see a behind the scenes that you very rarely are going to get to see. It screened as part of the festival. I got to interview the filmmakers, which was really, really fun. Obviously, my wife is, you know, she's an artistic director and dance studio owner, and you know, so I'm sort of, whenever there's a dance movie, I was always assigned it, but I really, really enjoyed it. And again, as someone who just is interested in the arts, works in the arts, getting to see how this sort of thing comes together is fascinating. And what's really cool is that it was released as a feature, but then was released as a documentary miniseries on CBC Gem, CBC's free streaming service here in Canada. And I think I like the miniseries version even more because it's one of those rare cases where I do think that by making it longer, it made it better. It gave more room for all of the stories and all of the characters to breathe, and we got to learn more about the people they were covering. So if you are in Canada, you actually can stream this for free, and I highly recommend that you do. So number 9, this is, you know, people are probably going to make fun of me for this, but I do not care. It is A Haunting in Venice, the Hercule Poirot film.
I'm not going to make fun of you for that. I loved that movie.
Nate sold me on it. I loved Murder on the Orient Express. Was a little less sold on Death on the Nile, but Nate saw Haunting. Yeah, no, it's very bad. Nate saw Haunting in Venice, was like, Adam, you have to see this.
Yeah. It's the best of the 3.
Yeah. The day it became available on Disney Plus, I had a couple glasses of red wine, and I soaked up that beautiful scenery, and I was like, this movie rules. So it, you know, a Hercule Poirot horror movie, what, like, when I remember seeing the trailer in the theater, and they sort of don't reveal that it's a Poirot movie until probably like the final 30 seconds.
Yeah. And then you see the mustache.
Yeah, I was like, but the build up to it, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. It's like a period horror thriller type thing. Like, this is very much my shit. And then they reveal it was a Poirot movie, and I turned to my cousin. I was like, what the hell is this? But yeah, no, it was, I loved it. So definitely in the top 10. Number 8 is going to be a controversial opinion, but Barbie. You know, I didn't love it as much as necessarily everybody else, but again, I think part of that has to do with not seeing it under ideal circumstances for the first time.
Sure.
I don't think the drive-in is the right place to see any movie for the first time. I will, you know, if Grease is screening there in the next year, I will, like, feels,
it's perfect.
Or Scream, like a movie that I've seen and know like the back of my hand. But Barbie is one of those movies where like there's so much there that I appreciate, and we did eventually rewatch it at home, and I definitely enjoyed it much more the second time around. But it's a little less my kind of thing. But I do really, really appreciate what it was able to achieve. Number 7 is, again, maybe a controversial opinion, but The Creator, which was a, you know, incredibly low budget, though you wouldn't know to look at it, sci-fi movie starring one of my favorite working actors today, John David Washington, directed by Gareth Edwards, who is a filmmaker whose work I absolutely admire, and I think is such a fascinating director because, you know, he comes from a visual effects background and he is able to, you know, make movies on the cheap that do not look like they were made on the cheap.
Oh,
and
that movie looked incredible. I think it was probably a close second to Godzilla -1 for special effects, because it's just as much, in my opinion, a feat of special effects as that movie, both because of the budget and honestly, regardless of the budget, it looks better than a lot of more expensive movies last year.
Really does,
by a long shot.
Mean, it's unfortunately like not the best written movie necessarily, but I think just from a visual standpoint, it was unlike anything else that I saw this year, and so I really, really appreciated it for that. And then number 6, which again I think will be controversial in this room, but is Spider-Man Across the Universe, Across the Spider-Verse, I should say, a film that I did very much enjoy, but didn't necessarily see it under the best circumstances, not least of which being that I did not know that it was part 1 of a 2-part story, and I felt very much when it wrapped up, I was like, wait, that's it? Like, it's a cliffhanger, and like I like cliffhangers on serialized television where I maybe only have to wait a week or maybe a season, but I don't like serialized cliffhangers where I have to wait 3 years before I'm going to get to see how everything plays out. And more importantly, like my biggest complaint in that regard is that it really feels like we're missing the final 20 minutes of that movie, so I'm not sure how they're going to make another 90-minute to 2-hour movie of what essentially is just 20 minutes of wrap up. But hey, I'm ready to be surprised. So as you alluded to earlier, Nate, nothing else looks like those movies, and the cast of that movie is also just like outstanding. Shameik Moore as Miles Morales is without a doubt my absolute favorite Spider-Man of all the cinematic Spider-Man. I do not care.
Wow.
That's I'm planting my flag in the sand. I think he absolutely rules. So yeah, lots to love there, but it just didn't manage to crack the top 5. So how about you? What's your bottom 10 or bottom 5, I should say?
Yeah. All right. My 10 to 6. So, my number 10 is Blackberry, which, again, also may be a controversial opinion among
It might
Canadians,
be a controversial opinion. We'll see.
But look, I mean, this movie is, I think is, again, one of the best of its class, which is like these sort of product origin story dramedies that are like floating around like Air. I thought this was miles better than Air, frankly. I think the acting is great. It has a particular tone and style to it that is unique to the filmmaker. And I think that's probably what makes it stand out the most, is that, you know, the style of the cinematography, the score, it all feels very crafted in a way that, you know, again, there are so many of these types of movies now, and many of them feel kind of formulaic. This has its own tone to it, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm a huge fan of Jay Baruchel. Love pretty much everything he's in. So there you go.
As a good Canadian boy should say.
Exactly. I've been watching that guy since he was on Popular Mechanics for Kids. So
hell yeah, with Alicia Cuthbert, my very first celebrity crush. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, number 9. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. I love this movie. I thought that movie was so great. And again, it's like I try to evaluate movies on their own terms, right?
Right.
And I feel like for what that movie is, which is a coming of age drama for like, you know, young girls, which again, not my personal experience, but like it is. I think that the acting is great. I think it's funny. And has a surprising amount of depth and nuance to the characters, particularly the mother character in that. So I just thought it was great. I had a great time. I don't really have any nits to pick about it, you know, like, which says a lot. Number 8, Anatomy of a Fall. I thought this movie, you know, again, it's solid for what it is, which is a courtroom drama ultimately at the end of the day. And it's a movie that, in my opinion, would be very comfortable on television. It kind of feels like a really great, it could be like a really great mini series, you know? I think it's very well made. The acting is great. But I also think that it doesn't quite have the scale of like of a movie in some ways. So that's the only thing that's like holding me back there. But I think it's very, very well crafted, especially in terms of the script and also in terms of the acting. Number 7, Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. I had a blast watching this movie. I was blown away. I think I watched it on a plane.
Oh, wow.
On a tiny screen in front of me, and was like, this is totally underrated, and I loved this. So I think what I would say about this is that it's like, again, there are tons of movies out there that are working with existing IP and just kind of like pumping out stuff, right? It's the Marvelization of everything. And this just it was so much better than it had any right to be. Again, in terms of the acting, the creativity, right? And the willingness to get geeky about the subject matter and not try to make it something that's going to be accessible to everyone, but something that really feels like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Like, I love that they did that. And weirdly, I think it has the same vibe as Barbie in that sense. Totally. Of just embracing the deep geekiness of a product and an intellectual property, and talking to the people who it really speaks to instead of trying to talk to everyone. So I just thought that was a fantastic movie. And again, I just had a blast. It was such a fun movie.
Well, I think, I mean, not to interrupt you, but seeing as spoiler alert, it's my number 5. So I feel like this is an appropriate point for me to jump in and for me to talk about it. I agree with everything that you're saying. And if I'm being completely honest, I think, Spider-Verse and Dungeons and Dragons are probably interchangeable in my list. It's just like the way that whenever the day I made my Letterboxd top 10 or whatever, it rose above it because I didn't have a horrible theatrical experience watching it. I watched it in the comfort of my own home. But I agree. It's written and directed by the team of Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley. And they directed one of my favorite comedies of the last, I guess it would have been the last decade, Game Night. Did you see Game Night with Rachel McAdams? And I
didn't, but I've heard a lot about it. It sounds great.
It's so much fun. And it's one of those movies where it has, again, it's way better than it has any right to be. And there are so many great surprises along the way. My wife and I watched it and we just kept going like, whoa, oh, wow. Like it's super entertaining. So like when Dungeons and Dragons was announced, I was like, this is not for me. Like, this just feels like lazy cash in. And then I was like, oh, they're doing it. That's kind of interesting. And then I heard nothing but good reviews for it. So it was like on sale on iTunes like shortly after it came out for like $10, and I was like, okay, well, I could rent it for $5 or own it for $10. I'm gonna roll the dice. And so I bought it, and just like I sat down and it was, again, Chris Pine is one of those actors who I always forget he exists until I see him in something, and then I'm like, man, that guy's charming and really funny.
He's the best part of almost every movie he's in, or one of the best parts, I would say.
But then great. Again, I'm like, and then I completely forget about him until he's in the next thing that he's the best part about the thing that he's in. So I love that the film doesn't take itself too seriously, but also isn't dismissive.
It's hilarious. It's so funny.
It has that sort of Python-esque humor at times where it's sort of like there's an irreverence but a respect for the source material. yeah, it's just I had such a good time watching it, and I laughed a ton. So yeah, like I said, it kind of is Spider-Verse maybe the better made film? Yeah, probably. Like again, nothing
From a
looks
craft
like that.
standpoint, sure.
From a craft standpoint, I think it's probably the better film. But in terms of like what brought me the most joy in the past year, I think Dungeons and Dragons absolutely sort of trounced it in that regard. So
I'm going to put a damper on our conversation because my number 6 choice is Oppenheimer.
oh yeah, okay. Yeah, so this is the end of the podcast where friendship is over, and it's been nice knowing you all. We had a solid 22 episodes. Thank you all for listening, and good night.
So here's the thing. Here's the thing about Oppenheimer. I thought this movie was very good.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it. It sounds like you loved it.
Well,
No, I know. I'm sorry. You
I saw is pretty good.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I think all of the constituent parts of this movie are very, very good, right? I think it deserved most of the awards it won last night. I think, like cinematography, editing, it's a Christopher Nolan movie. Like all the craft stuff is so on point. I think that, I think that both of the acting awards it got, well-deserved, right? Cillian Murphy's excellent. Robert Downey Jr. is also excellent. However, I think a couple things. I actually don't think the script is super strong. Okay. I think it's probably an incredibly difficult book to adapt. But for me, the black and white segments with Robert Downey Jr. Don't feel essential to the story. And I don't think that Strauss is a strong enough foil to Oppenheimer to warrant the emphasis that's put on that part of the story. And that's a pretty integral part of the movie. And so I think for me that was hard to get over.
And I don't disagree with you. I think it's one of those weird things where until you've seen the film, you spend the first hour kind of not understanding where they're going with the black and white stuff. And then when you rewatch the movie, which I spoiler alert, I saw it 3 times in theaters. When you rewatch the movie and you have a better understanding of where it's going, you're like, okay, I understand where this is going. Now I just wish that those segments were stronger. So I don't disagree with you that that element of it is a little bit flawed.
Yeah, and I think that because of that, right? This is that classic thing that we always talk about. It's like, every movie has weaknesses. It's just a matter of whether you can forgive them or not, right? Yeah. And a movie that makes you love it, you forgive the weaknesses and you just say, well, that's just part of the movie, right? I mean, like, totally. That's just the way it is, right? And so for me, I think probably because of that structural thing, the other things that are pretty common in Christopher Nolan movies started bugging me. So it's like, the female characters are not very strong in that movie. And that's kind of a classic Christopher Nolan problem that is really not addressed in this movie at all. And I find that very disappointing because it's like, this movie you'll get your chance.
Okay, fine.
I think like he is clearly growing and changing with this movie, and that I respect. But to me, this feels like a movie where he is still really learning a lot and hasn't totally figured some of this stuff out. And I'll come back to this theme, but I don't think he's letting enough people in. I think that he is maintaining too much control, too much auteurship over his movies, and not allowing people to challenge him, inviting in key collaborators on the sort of production side. I mean, again, great actors involved, but I think that he needs help with his scripts. He needs help with the sort of that part of it to just get away from some of the traps I think he keeps falling in.
There is an argument to be made that his best films are the films that he is a co-writer on, and argue whether or not it's Jonathan Nolan, his brother, is sort of propping him up. I know David S. Goyer was involved in the Batman films to a certain extent. But I would maybe be inclined to agree with you that having someone else there to bounce ideas off in the script standpoint, because I do think, again, he's one of my guys. So, and I know I will have my moment in the sun to talk about this movie, but I think everywhere else, like, he is a very good collaborator, and based on what everybody else said last night, he is a very good collaborator. But I think you're right. That seems to be the one sort of sore spot is in the writing. So I will also concede that point to you. So there you go.
Yeah. But you know, like, I love Christopher Nolan, just to be clear, and like I think my biggest reason why this is where it is on this list is because I just don't think it's his best movie that he's made. And we don't need to get into our full rankings of Christopher Nolan, but I think that
because we did that the other night.
Yeah, and we went on for like an hour. But like I feel like there are others that outrank it, multiple other movies that outrank Oppenheimer in his list for me. So that's why it is where it is.
Okay. Well, I will have my opportunity to rebut that. So, yes, let's talk top fives.
Yes.
And do we want to go back and forth, like my number 5, your number 5, and then sort of meet at the end? Okay. So, well, we sort of did my number 5, which was Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. So, Nate, what do you have as your number 5?
So my number 5 is Poor Things, which I like a lot of this list, as you were saying, it's like, it just depends on the day. I thought all of these were really great movies. And so this could be higher, it could be lower, but I thought this was a fantastic movie, really imaginative. You know, it deserves, again, everything it won in terms of, you know, costume. Well, it definitely deserves most of the things it won in terms of costume design, makeup and hairstyling, production design. I mean, it's an incredible looking movie. I think I'm happy it didn't win cinematography. I think like one of the weaknesses of this film, again, it's like, this is the reason it's not higher, is that like, I think sometimes it goes a little bit overboard on style without a good reason. Like, there are moments in this film where suddenly you'll be looking through a fisheye lens for no good reason. And it's just like, it's those sorts of flourishes that I'm like, again, much like what I was saying about Oppenheimer, you need someone to rein it in a little bit and just be like, why are you doing that? Like just challenge the director, right? Yorgos.
Yeah. Needs to feel motivated.
Yeah, and be like, what are you trying to say to the audience right now? What are you trying to convey? And sometimes I think it goes a little too far in just like an experimental direction that feels a little unguided. But you know, we got to talk about it. Emma Stone.
Yep.
Won Best Leading Actress.
And nobody was more surprised than Emma Stone. To her credit, I do think that was a very genuine, like, I was kind of like on my phone because I was like, oh, well, like, they're going to say Lily Gladstone. And then they said Emma Stone, and I literally went, wait, what the f-? And like looked up, and she also seemed to go, wait, what the f-? Like, nobody was expecting that. Yeah,
totally. I mean, it was like, I think everyone saw her as a second place, but I don't think anyone expected her to pull ahead. And I saw a really good meme on Twitter of the scene on The Simpsons where, you know, Bart is rewinding the footage of
the footage of Ralph and Lisa,
right, at the Krusty show when Lisa blows up at him and it's like, I don't, you know, whatever. And he's like, oh, you can see the exact moment when his heart breaks, and it's a picture of Emma Stone, because like she looked kind of devastated that she won, conflicted, worried, you know, because it's like, people really thought this was a lockup, and it would have been a very historic Oscar.
Yes.
And I think it would have been, again, like, this was a horse race. I think both of them are very well deserved. I personally went back and forth on my opinions about who should really get it, partly because they are apples and oranges performances.
Yeah.
They're almost at opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of what they're trying to do. Yeah. And so, like, how do you even compare them?
Yes. I mean, and that always is sort of the tricky thing with a category like this. You know, it's sort of the classic thing of it's ironic in the end, because I'm in terms of best actors, my guy won, the guy I was rooting for, but I was sort of saying, you know, the sort of other person who is sort of leading that race, Mr. Maestro, I say, you know, I've for the last couple of years been like, I'm just tired of the guy who does an impression winning the Academy Award, because it's like, is it about best actor or is it about best impression? And while I recognize that Cillian Murphy is also playing a real life person, it's not like everybody knows what J. Robert Oppenheimer looked and sounded like. Like, he really kind of got to craft that role himself, I think. But again, it's just the idea of like if you're creating a character from scratch versus you have something to imitate or replicate, I think it's more impressive when you create something from scratch. But in this case, like that's not they really are. They're just these roles. And again, I have not seen Poor Things. I've only seen an hour and 40 minutes of Killers of the Flower Moon. But from those hour and 40 minutes, I gotta say, Lily Gladstone is without a doubt one of the highlights of that film, and she's doing some incredible work. So, but I can tell, even having just seen the trailer of Poor Things and the what I've seen of Killers of the Flower Moon, that those performances could not be more different. And so to try and pick between the two of them, like how do you really?
For sure. And I think like, one of the things to celebrate for me this year, I think, is that, you get to see a few nominees that are doing these really big, outlandish performances, which to your point is not usually what gets nominated. And I think it's very cool that you're starting to see those things actually in the running, and of course, like Emma Stone is one of them. She's literally playing a grown woman with a baby's brain that is rapidly developing throughout the movie, which is just like it's just not something that anyone can relate to, right? It's a science fiction concept that she is playing, and she does an absolutely amazing job of it. It's very entertaining, surprisingly nuanced while also being very big. Mark Ruffalo also in this movie, same sort of thing, where it's just like he's hilarious in this movie and he's playing an enormous role. I mean, literally there's a moment in this movie where he does a parody of A Streetcar Named Desire, right?
Oh, wow.
Like in the middle of this movie, right? And it's just like, but that's accepted. And of course, Ryan Gosling, right? I mean, again, Ken is a total parody character that is just enormous and hilarious.
He's a cartoon character,
but like
he literally is. He
character.
is a Simpsons character, for lack of a better term.
Right.
Like it's
right.
So yeah.
But it's like it's heartening to see those kinds of roles in the mix because it does get a little monotonous some years where it's just like, it's like it's 5 impressions and who did the best impression. So I'm here for that, but I do have mixed feelings about Emma Stone's win. I think it's great. It's a great role, but it's maybe unfortunate that Lily Gladstone didn't get her recognition as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So what about you? What about your number 4?
So my number 4 I gave to a little film called Anatomy of a Fall, a film that you also included in your top 10, though not as high as me. And it's interesting. This is one of those movies that I kind of didn't know much going into it, apart from the fact that my coworker who saw it didn't really like it. Okay. And I was present for when we interviewed the director, and so I kind of like sat in and on that interview, but like didn't really. I mean, A, the interview was in French, and B, I hadn't seen the film, so I really didn't know what they were discussing at all. So I kind of went into it not knowing what to expect, but I sort of said the thing that I came away with, and I love a courtroom drama.
Me too.
This was, and I love a good kind of like whodunit, which this, in a weird way, is a bit of a whodunit. Our obsession with true crime run amok, I guess, is what it is. But I guess what I thought was so interesting is that it is the antithesis of what a American courtroom drama is. It's interesting because I actually watched it not too far off from when I watched William Friedkin's final film, The Caine Mutiny Court Martial, which is a very traditional sort of American courtroom drama. And so it was just sort of interesting to compare the differences and the similarities and just like how an American style version of that differs from a European style of that, and how this one's more sort of reflective and non it isn't like a spectacle like and the reality is, like, if a famous author was accused of murdering their husband in America, it would be an absolute spectacle. Like, it would be a shit show. And so it's just I just thought, and I think Sandra Hüller gave, again, we're talking about best actress performances. Yeah. I think she gives one of the best performances of the year. Again, I haven't seen all of Lily Gladstone's performance. I haven't seen Emma's performance, but of the ones I had seen, like, I would have given it to her because I think it is a very nuanced performance. Again, one of the brilliant. They made the joke last night of like, I've seen this movie multiple times and I still don't know if she did it. I think that's really true. I spent the movie being like, I don't know. Like, and apparently that is intentional. The director really didn't want you to know, wants you to sort of form your own opinion. But it's just, it's unlike what I'm sort of used to. And I liked that about it. Again, it's not going to be for everyone. It's a movie that is a little on the longer side and is obviously not all in English. But I really think that if you're someone who enjoys that like classic courtroom drama, this is one that's worth giving a chance, because you'll get what you expect, but not how you expect it is the best. And I have to say, the dog gives one of the best performances all year. I think the dog should have been nominated for something, because like it really, like, it is some real good dog acting. So
yeah. Well, and that movie won Best Original Screenplay, and I think that was super well deserved. I think that script is really incredible, and like you said, strikes that balance of always keeping you wondering, like, number one, is she innocent? Is she not? And also number two, like, will her son defend her in the end, or will he do something else? And it really just keeps you guessing. So I think that's I enjoyed it a lot.
And again, is the son telling the truth, or is he lying? We don't, like, it's just the
right.
way that it plays with this, the nuances of what is the truth, what is the right thing to do, morals, all that. I think that's really what makes it so fascinating. So, Nate, what's your number 4?
So my number 4 is Barbie. And again, like, this is another movie where I just had a hell of a time in the theater, seeing it with other people. It's fun. It is light. And I don't think it takes itself too seriously, even though it has moments that are aiming for something a little bit bigger, but it's silly, and that's fine. I think the thing that I just keep coming back to is, like, there again and again, there were moments when I was watching the movie that I'm like, I just can't believe this is on screen. Like, this is
yeah,
it's crazy that this got made, and it got made in the way that it was. I think of it as being, it's both a feat of directing, right? And I'll come back to that in a moment, but it's also a feat of producing in the same way that I think of, like, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a feat of producing, where it's just like, they were able to wrangle all this IP and all of these, like, stakeholders that, of course, are concerned about how things are presented and blah, 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 into something that was genuinely creative, entertaining, unique, all that stuff. And so I just thought it was, again, it's incredible that it even exists as a cultural artifact, and it clearly touched so many people. Coming back to the directing side of it, and this is one of the reasons why, of course, like many people, I think that Greta Gerwig was kind of snubbed in this. It's not just like, the old, I think it's a Billy Crystalism of like, oh, I guess it directed itself. Like, if it gets Best Picture, I understand, like, there's a desire for them to get Best Director. But look, I think the bottom line is, maybe the best thing about that movie is the directing, in the sense that if anything was out of alignment, this movie just wouldn't work. And so it's entirely 100% reliant on the vision of someone like Greta Gerwig to have her hand on every element of the production design, every element of people's performances. Like, the tone of these performances is so outlandish, but to make it feel like a coherent world, it just wouldn't work without the directing. And so from that standpoint, I just think it's one of the most incredible pieces of directing of the year, but hands down.
Well, and I mean, we obviously have to address the fact that it was snubbed in that regard. She was not nominated.
Yep.
And a fact that I forgot, because I literally, as the show started last night and we were sort of talking about it, I was like, I don't know, man. I think Greta could still maybe win Best Director. And you're like, she's not nominated.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, I completely forgot.
Yeah.
But that to me, like, as much as I wanted my boy Chris Nolan to finally get his flowers, in my mind, I was like, but if he loses to Greta Gerwig, I 100% think that's justified, because I think she really managed to do something that not a lot of people could do. And it is insane that she was not nominated.
Totally. And yeah, I think that Greta is a true auteur. It's like, even when, so one of the movies that I rewatch every year around Christmas is Little Women. Her version, I like both versions, but her version of Little Women And I think it's interesting because it's actually a really similar movie in some ways, where she's taking, again, this cultural artifact that I think is very important, especially to young women growing up, and interpreting it in this way that's very contemporary, and kind of a little bit postmodern, but also still very sincere and very much like not trying to make fun of people or make fun of the source material, but also comment on it and update it. And I just think, yeah, she's an incredibly interesting filmmaker. Is the messaging in this movie feminism 101? Yes, it is. Do I think that's a problem? No, I don't. I think that it's like there is still very much a place for that level of introducing people to those ideas in popular movies, because lots of people still don't see the world that way. So why not?
Well, and I obviously I didn't talk a ton about this because I didn't have it in my top 5. So I'm using this as my opportunity to heap praise on it, despite it not cracking the top 5. But I will say, one of the things that I think the film doesn't get enough credit for is that it does address these very serious, very real subjects without it ever feeling like it's hitting you over the head with a blunt hammer. And unless it's doing so in a way that's meant to do so played for comedy. So obviously there are moments when Ken says things that it's played for comedy, but I think we talked about this before, but I think it was off mic. But I remember there was an Amy Poehler movie that came out a couple years ago where it was, it was a movie that had a whole thing about feminism. And there was a teenager and she was at the dinner table and she gets frustrated with her mom and she literally slams on the table and just shouts, "F- the patriarchy," and storms out. And I'm just like, kids don't talk like this. This is not realistic.
Right.
Like, I understand what you're trying to say, but you're not managing to express what you're trying to express in a natural way. And it's just alienating and off-putting because it feels so foreign. And I think
yes.
that's the thing that Barbie does better than anything else, is that it is able to address these serious issues in an entertaining and poignant and touching way that you never feel like you're being lectured, but you do still come away moved and arguably changed.
So it came up in the context of me saying, I've never seen a movie that uses the word patriarchy so much. And then you were like, oh, I remember one other movie. But I think the thing is that, like, the thing that strikes me about this movie, and this is coming back now that you're bringing up this conversation, is that, like, this movie treats feminism like Elf treats Christmas spirit.
Yes.
It's like, it is just this, it's this kind of magical thing. And we all know that, like, that's not the way the real world works, but that's okay. It's like this movie has its own logic, and it's kind of putting forth a world where it's like, wow, wouldn't it be great if we just knew the contradictions, all that stuff would go away. And it's a magical movie. So, like, I love it. I think it's great. And again, I think it's going to stick with us long past this year. It's really a cultural touchstone.
The other thing I want to sort of heap praise on is the fact that it has no right being as good as it is. Sort of, you touched on this, the wrangling of the IP. But when it was announced, I really was like, this thing is not going to work. Like, this is going to just be a 90-minute toy commercial. And, it's basically, I had the same thoughts I had when it was announced, when the Lego movie was announced, of like, why does this thing exist? Like, this is the most cynical cash-in, like, bullshit. Oh, they cast Margot Robbie as Barbie and Ryan Gosling as Ken. Yeah, like, this isn't going to be any good. And ironically, much like the Lego movie, it ended up working way better than I anticipated. And so I sort of, like, I need to, like, eat crow. It's funny. This movie, obviously, I guess it came out last year, but the Super Mario Brothers movie, which I bring up only because my son has started to become obsessed with it, and I have now rewatched the first 40 minutes of it multiple times. But that movie is very much the exact opposite of the Lego movie, in that it is just nothing but a cynical cash grab and a nostalgia play, and like it's just it's beautiful to look at, but like it's utterly hollow. And so I have to give Barbie credit for not going in that direction and actually managing to have something to say, and doing so in a poignant and entertaining way. That's very, very difficult to do. And to your point, a lot of that comes down to the writing, which was Greta Gerwig and her partner Noah Baumbach, and the direction. So chapeau to Miss Gerwig. Absolutely.
Indeed. So what's your number 3, Adam?
My number 3 is Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, one of the worst titles of a movie this year. But to be honest, I'm surprised it's this high, because reflecting on it, I kind of was underwhelmed by this movie. I think if, in my rankings of the Mission Impossible series, this is probably near the bottom. I mean, it's not nearly as bad as Part 2. But I didn't have as much love for this film as I wanted. I think, and this is very pedantic and very stupid, but I spent the money to go see this in IMAX. I drove to another city so that I could see it in IMAX, proper, full, actual IMAX, not Limax. And it never once opened up the aspect ratio to IMAX. And I was like, why did I spend all this money to do this? I feel ripped off.
You're preaching to the choir, because of course I'm the other person in the world who's also like actively pissed off by this, because one of my all-time favorite like in theater experiences is Ghost Protocol, which has a mind-blowing like IMAX sequence. Probably the best IMAX sequence in my opinion on film. And so it was disappointing. And it's one of the reasons I go to those movies, because I love that series, and I love that they do the big format stuff.
And they actively promoted see it in IMAX, filmed for IMAX, and then and I guess technically but anyway, so I think I just felt burned on that the entire time. But it's at the end of the day, I love these movies. I love the James Bond series, and I've said before that I think in many ways the Mission Impossible movies are doing the James Bond series better than James Bond is in some ways. They have gadgets, they have levity, they have fun, they're entertaining, they've got great stunts. The stunts in this, like when Tom Cruise explains why the motorcycle jump is really impressive, I guess I'm impressed, but it kind of pales in comparison to him holding onto a jet plane with his bare hands. So maybe he's just sort of he's hoisted by his own petard. I don't know, but at the end of the day, these movies are super, super fun, and that's I want a good popcorn blockbuster, and I got my good popcorn blockbuster, and it was the best popcorn blockbuster of the year for my money. So flaws, but I still really, really enjoyed it. And unlike Spider-Verse, I will say that despite it being a quote-unquote part 1, which now it's weird, in streaming they've removed that because they said part 2 is going to take so long to come out that they're kind of distancing the fact that it's a two-parter, but it's not, because at the end of the day, yes, there are loose ends, but it is a self-contained story, so it doesn't feel like you're leaving the theater well, how is this going to wrap up? And kind of like the old James Bond movies, they were never truly serialized, but they all kind of played off of each other, and they always ended in Blofeld's still at large and stuff like that. So that was my biggest complaint with Spider-Verse. I do not have that complaint with this one. So is it like the impressive film nerdy answer? No, it's a very basic Hollywood 101 answer, but what can I say? I love these movies. So
hey, I do too, and I think this one didn't crack my top 10, but it is. I had a great time watching it. I just think, as you already said, compared to other entries in the series, I was a little disappointed, I think, but had a great time overall. I mean, so this movie did not get many nominations, only for sound and visual effects. Do you feel like that was fair? Was it snubbed? Was there anything else that you feel like it really should have got?
Oh, no. I mean, it's not even one of the best looking Mission Impossibles. I can't remember who the GP is on it, but it's not, as you say, Ghost Protocol is just jaw-droppingly gorgeous. And then Rogue Nation, I thought, was also very, 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 very beautiful. And it might be the same cinematographer. I can't remember, but again, I don't go to these movies expecting Oscar caliber work. The irony that those James Bond movies started getting best cinematography nominations, it's insane. It's the exception, not the rule. I am very vocal in my dislike for Marvel and the Marvel Cinematic Universe and those kind of movies, and this is of the blockbusters that have come out in the last few years. Like, this is what I like. This is what I prefer. And I'm excited that these kind of movies are still getting made. Like, I know it's still
Me
IP
too.
and it's in a long series and it stars friggin' Tom Cruise, like one of the biggest movie stars in the world. But in a weird way, like, it kind of still feels like it's the underdog series. So I want them to do well. And that's why, like, again, I'm putting it in my top 3 just because it's like, I'm happy it exists and I want it to continue to exist until that
Same.
man dies in a stunt accident of his own
dear
making.
God.
Like,
Knock
that,
on wood.
keep going, buddy.
Yep.
Yeah, knock on
Amen.
wood. I really hope I haven't jinxed it. But
Oh God.
okay, how about your number 3?
So my number 3 is something very different. My number 3 is Past Lives, which I was so touched by this movie. I feel like, part of it is that it really hit home for me because it is a movie about living far from where you come from. And, and it also takes place in the early 2000s. So it's like, they're always communicating on Skype and like all of that is just super familiar to me. And so I think that was definitely part of it. But I thought the script, the acting, and honestly, actually the cinematography in this movie is phenomenal. It's kind of it has an unusual tone, unusual, sort of setup for the story. A great framing device. I don't think it's a spoiler. Right at the very beginning of the movie, it opens with strangers, people who are not part of the story, looking across a bar at our main characters and speculating about what their relationship is to one another. And you just have these 3 characters, 2 men, 1 woman, and they're sort of like trying to figure out like what's going on there because the vibe is really weird. And then you kind of find out the answer to that throughout the movie. So I thought it was really, really excellent. It's hard to kind of capture what I thought was so great about it, but it was just great.
Right.
It was a captivating experience front to back, very well paced, and just beautiful. So yeah, I would highly recommend you add it to your priority watch list.
Yeah, based on the trailer and everything, it doesn't really seem like my kind of movie.
I said the same thing. I put it off for ages.
And I love to be surprised by movies like that. And that's kind of how I felt about Anatomy of a Fall. It was like,
Yeah.
I'm watching it because it's an Oscar-nominated movie and I feel like I have to, but then I ended up coming away being like, I really enjoyed that much more than I thought I did. So there's nothing better than that feeling of going into something with trepidation or maybe, like feeling like this is going to be a chore and then coming away being like, actually, that was really touching. I really, really enjoyed that. So yeah, I'm going to have to make sure to get around to seeing that.
Adam, what about your number 2? What's your number 2?
I think my number 2 is going to surprise a lot of people because it didn't receive a single Oscar nomination. It was completely overlooked. But up until the release date of my number 1, which, like, if you've done the math, you will figure out what my number 1 is. This was my hands down my favorite movie of the year, and was nothing I saw because I saw it early at a press screening, and so from the day I saw it, for months, nothing even came close to usurping its position as number 1 until it eventually did get usurped. But that is Matt Johnson's Blackberry, a film that I just absolutely adored. The best way to describe it for people who haven't seen it is like it's the Canadian Social Network. Like it's basically very similar in tone and style, but in a weird way, I like this movie more than The Social Network because I just think it's there's something about it, and I still haven't really been able to put my finger on what I love about it. I don't know if it's the pacing or if it's the energy or if it's the writing or if it's the casting, but you've got this sort of and yes, of course, part of it is that it's like the Canadian in me, and I feel good, rooting for my home country. But it's telling the story of the origins of the rise and fall of BlackBerry, and it does so in a way that is stylish and, as you alluded to, very, very humorous, but in a way that is just sort of like not what we normally expect from a Canadian film. I mean, at the risk of sounding insulting, both me and my coworker, when we left the press screening, we were like, that was really good. And it didn't look Canadian. Like, they have managed to the movie was made for, I think I looked up the budget the other day. It was something like only $5 million.
Wow.
And that, I don't know if that's $5 million Canadian or $5 million American, but regardless, only $5 million, and it does not look it.
No.
Like they've done a phenomenal job of like creating that sort of high budget level, biopic kind of look without the affordances that, David Fincher, I'm going to look up the budget of The Social Network just to compare. So David Fincher's The Social Network was made for $40 million.
Right.
I'm not trying to throw shade. I genuinely think this movie looks as good, if not better, than The Social Network.
Yeah.
No offense to Jeff Cronenworth, a man who I really, really, really admire. But yeah, there's just something about this movie, and a part of it is I love Matt Johnson as a filmmaker. Mm-hmm. I loved his previous 2 films. I loved his TV series, Nirvana the Band, The Show. I think he's got a really interesting sense of humor. I think he has a really interesting sense of style.
Yeah.
I think he's cast this film in such an incredible, like having Jay Baruchel as the emotional center of the film.
Yeah.
And then having Glenn Howerton as this absolute
maniac
psychopath. And
that one line is the line of the year for me, partly because, of course, it's like this is where we grew up. But
Yeah.
like, I'm from Waterloo,
exactly.
where the vampires live. Is like I love that so dearly.
But then you have in between, you have Matt Johnson sort of playing the kind of like the core of the story, and he's it's interesting because when people online were sort of saying who was overlooked, blah blah blah, there were some people that said like Glenn Howerton's performance in Blackberry was overlooked. And I agree, like it was a very strong performance, but for me, like I really do think that Johnson's performance is incredible. Like he's the bridge point between all of this, and I don't think he's getting sort of enough credit for that. So yeah, I don't know, man. It's hard. It's been a while since I saw it, admittedly. Although interestingly enough, this as well was because it was partially funded by the CBC. This was also released as a mini series for free in Canada, where they recut the film and essentially just added in a couple deleted scenes and some credits. And there's not a ton extra, but I did rewatch the sort of mini series version, and I loved it just as much the second time around.
Yeah.
There's something about this movie, I don't know what it is, but it just hits a very sweet spot for me, and I absolutely loved it. And for basically 6 months, I was like, yeah, this is the best thing I've seen all year. So if you haven't seen it, please seek it out. I think you will thoroughly enjoy it.
Totally. I mean, I love this movie. I think, like, to your point about The Social Network, I think the 2 key differences I see are that script wise, it's definitely not an Aaron Sorkin script, in the sense that, like,
no, it is not.
His scripts are so finely tuned, so verbose and rhythmic. They're wonderful, but they're poetry.
I love it. Yeah.
But I think, like, this movie, on the other hand, is really leaning into improvisation, I think, or so it seems. At the very least, it has that tone of being kind of improvisational. Yeah. I think it probably because, like, that's the way that Matt Johnson seems to operate to a certain extent in building that kind of rapport with the actors. And then the other thing is, I think on the cinematography, I agree. I think it looks great. And it's partly because it's also leaning into a little bit about to that sort of documentary sort of look, right?
Yeah,
that we've been talking about on the show. Of, like, it's a little bit shaky. The camera's moving around. Like, it doesn't look like they have a lot of coverage, right? But it is really well shot, and it kind of contributes to that sense of reality in the movie. So I agree. I think it's a fantastic movie, and is contributing, again, a very unique tone to that sort of workplace drama that's becoming so popular right now.
All right, how about you? What's your number 2?
So we're returning to another one we've talked about a little bit here. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is my number 2 of the year. And I think, again, we've already said a little bit about this. I agree with you that, like, the characters and the actors behind the characters are incredibly lovable and relatable. Maybe the best depiction of a Spider-Man, I think. Mm-hmm. I think the thing that stands out for me a lot, like Barbie as well, is just like, this is a movie that's full of things that we've seen tons of over the last decade, right? This sort of IP, right? This focus on an existing IP. It's a part one, as you pointed out. It's also big. It's got a whole multiverse sort of thing going on, which is going on,
sure does.
just over the fence in like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I think the thing that stands out to me is just that, again, it does it so much better than the other movies that are currently out there. Right. I think that the way that it's handling the multiverse stuff is very interesting. It's really taking advantage of it in terms of showing you different, like not just different worlds, but like different characters, different parallel realities that have something to say about the main character's reality, different art styles. Like it's taking advantage of the fact that it's animated. So when you go through a portal, it looks like a completely different cartoon. Right. And so I just think that that's incredible. I think the score actually got snubbed at the Oscars.
Okay.
Not only is it just great to listen to, but I think that, again, it is really it matches the ambition of the animation in terms of incorporating different styles and transitioning into different types of music when you go through those portals. It's just really the craft in this movie is just absolutely incredible.
Without a doubt. I mean, you did say like nothing looks like this, and nothing looks like this. Like, and I remember seeing the first film and just being absolutely blown away by that art style. And I think, truthfully, I think that's maybe why this movie didn't hit quite as hard, is just because that first one was so groundbreaking and so good that it was like kind of hard to live up to the level set by that previous one. And for my money, I'm not sure that it did, but clearly I'm alone in that opinion.
My feeling is, well, I don't know if you're alone. I think a lot of, again, it didn't win Best Animated Feature, and I think part of that is fair. What you're getting at, which is that people are like, well, the first one was groundbreaking, but the second one feels like kind of more of the same. But what I would say is, I think a few of my favorite shots of the year are from this movie. It's like, the shot of Miles Morales and Gwen Stacy sitting upside down, talking to each other with the city upside down behind them is absolutely iconic. I think it's one of the best Spider-Man scenes in any movie. The sort of dynamic between Gwen Stacy and her father and the use of color in sort of communicating their relationship is, again, taking advantage of the medium, really unique, really moving. The emotional parts of this movie are just as good as the action, and that is so unusual for these kinds of movies. On the part one-ness of it all, I did have the benefit of knowing that this was a part one going in, so I think that definitely set my expectations better. But I also think that much more than Dune Part 1, for example, this did feel more like a complete story to me. And I found the cliffhanger very satisfying, because it really feels like they painted themselves into a corner. Like, I don't know. Right. I literally don't know what's going to happen in the next movie, and I don't know how they're going to get out of it from a story standpoint. So if they stick the landing, I think it'll be incredible. Or it could just be a mystery box. It could be a J.J. Abrams of like, it's the great beginning of a story and they don't actually know what the ending is. But I pray that they stick the landing, because I think it's really great.
I think that is really ultimately what my biggest complaint was, is that the movie felt a little too sprawling. Like, I loved all the stuff with Gwen, and like, I was kind of like, well, is that, we've had Miles's story, can this be just Gwen's story? But like, then it becomes both their stories, and then, as I said, it's sort of I'm just so burned out on the multiverse stuff. Like, and I do not watch all the Marvel movies because I don't care for the Marvel movies, and like, even the ones that I have seen, and let's be honest, the last live action Spider-Man movie did the multiverse thing. Like, do we have to keep coming back to this? Like, I think that was part, and granted, across the first film also dealt with the multiverse stuff, but I think it did the multiverse better than anything else has. So I was just like, we've already done that. Like, just stop. Just do a simple like Spider-Man. Like, please don't. But that's just me. I will say the person I saw was sitting next to was thoroughly enjoying the film to the point of it being very obnoxious.
Oh no.
But But so like there are people. I'm happy for her. I'm glad she loved it as much as she did. But it was just like it was a bit much. Like the entire seat is shaking a bit much.
Wow.
But yeah. So like it's again. I think it was like it's part of that like not knowing what to expect, but also going in with high expectations is why it didn't work as well for me. But it's interesting because you said like you went in knowing that it was a part one. I didn't go in knowing it was a part one, and look at the sort of difference in our rankings of it. And I do think, again, I think expectations really do play a huge part in how we view and experience these films.
Absolutely. And I think the part one thing is everyone's done it a little bit differently. Like Dune was marketed as just Dune, and then in the final credits it was like Dune part one. Right, and then you have Dead Reckoning starting with part one in the title and then getting rid of it retroactively. And it's just like, it just doesn't seem, it's almost like this whole thing doesn't totally work. And
it's almost like we shouldn't do that.
And maybe
Let's not do that anymore.
Sequels, and maybe it's okay if you're like sequel, like, classic example, right? You have Empire Strikes Back. It's like, it's a complete story, but it's a bittersweet ending that has a bit of a cliffhanger. And like that's a sweet spot, right? And it's like I think other people can do it.
Or even the most famous part one, part two kind of situation of like The Godfather. Like The Godfather. Granted, The Godfather is called The Godfather, and then it's Godfather Part Two. But like Coppola very much said that it was meant to be a Part two was called Part Two because it was meant to be a continuation. But the first film like ends and it is a definitive ending, and then the second film ends and it's a definitive ending. But like that, it's. I agree. I think it's an interesting experiment, and it's interesting how many films in the last 2 years have gone that route.
Right.
And my hope is that filmmakers are maybe recognizing that unless we can put the next movie out like 3 to 6 months later, this is maybe not the way to market something.
Totally.
But
although I will say I just saw Dune 2, and I thought that it did a very good job of keeping the story open for not just a sequel, but like it's clear that the story's not over, while also having a definitive conclusion to this chapter in the story. And so
I would 100% agree.
But again, it does have the benefit of, this is the second half of a book that also had a definitive ending. So
yes.
Anyway.
And then like several sequels of 700-page sequels. But,
yes, varying quality.
We'll see what happens there.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, Adam. What is your number one?
Drum roll, please. No, I mean, look, it's my number one's Oppenheimer.
Sure.
And I Nate and I sort of had this long discussion the other night, so we're not going to recreate it. But look, I alluded to the fact that before I had been watching movies for work, and I had been going to the movies, and I had been coming away really sort of just kind of let down. And honestly, Mission Impossible is a perfect example of that. Like, I went in with such high expectations and was just kind of like, eh. And so I was really starting to think, like, do I just not like movies anymore? Like, has it become a job, and therefore it is no longer a hobby or an entertainment or a way to, like, has the magic died? And then I went and saw Oppenheimer opening week, not opening weekend, but opening week, 70mm IMAX. I drove out to Mississauga with my cousin to go see it, and I just was absolutely transfixed and transported, and I left that movie buzzing and just feeling like, nope, it's just the movies before have been lackluster, and it just takes something truly spectacular, and I love movies, and this is why I love movies.
Yeah.
I think it's, obviously the film did very well last night, as was predicted, and I kind of can't really argue with any of the things that it lost. I at the end of the day, like, I think actress and let's costume design, makeup and hairstyling, fine, like, whatever. Production design, sure. Sound, yeah. Adapted screenplay, for all the reasons you mentioned, Nate. Like, I'm not upset that it didn't win those, and I think all of the things that it won, I 100% agree. I think Cillian Murphy, without question, gave one of the most incredible performances this year.
Definitely.
The amount of nuance and subtlety. You talked earlier about how a lot of big performances were getting plaudits this year. But I think what is so remarkable about his performance is just how subtle it is. It is, which is ironic because you've got, if you saw it in 70mm IMAX, you're seeing his face on a giant 100-foot screen, and it just consumes every inch of it, and then yet he still manages to keep it so restrained and subtle.
That's the thing. There's nowhere to hide, right, in his performance, because he literally has an IMAX camera pointed in his face that can see every nook and cranny and every twitch of his eye. Like if his mind is wandering or he's thinking about his performance, you're going to see it in that context, and you don't. It's incredibly nuanced and always in the moment of the performance, which I think is incredible.
So I mean, for me, that was a deadlock. I walked out of that theater, I was like, nothing's going to top this. And then I saw Maestro a few months later, and everyone's like, Bradley Cooper. And I was like, no, not don't even try. Actor in a supporting role. Would I have loved Ryan Gosling to win it for Ken? Yeah, 100%. Because I think comedies are so underappreciated. Yeah. As everyone says, it's way harder to do comedy than it is to do drama. That being said, I think Robert Downey Jr., part of it is the sort of you've been doing this for long enough and now we're giving you your flowers after all these years kind of situation. But that being said, I do think it's also well-deserved. I think he does, despite that character or that, the conceit there maybe being flawed, as you pointed out, he does an incredible job with it. And it is a very interesting turn for him because you don't normally see him anymore anyways in those sort of character actor roles. So I think, it is an incredible performance. Cinematography, I mean,
yeah, indisputable. I mean, it is a beautiful looking movie.
Yeah. And I've seen it now twice in 70mm IMAX, once in regular IMAX. It's stunning. It is just, and the way that those images hit you when you see them in that big huge format is just, it's just amazing. And then film editing, I said some people were like, oh man, it's 3.5 hours long, and I said, you know what, I think this movie moves like a freight train.
Yeah,
I remember watching it the very first, and by the third viewing I was like, okay, this does feel a little heavy, you could trim a little fat here. But the first time I saw it, my Apple Watch sort of taps on the hour, and I realized I was feeling the second tap, so it had been 2 hours.
Wow.
And I was like, it's been 2 hours? I thought it had been maybe 45 minutes. I really do think this movie moves. It's so well paced. It's so well. I think the structure, while some people don't love the structure, I think the structure is really interesting, and I think they've done a really good job of piecing it together in a way that's, you maybe can't follow it perfectly, but you're never totally lost. And again, to that point of the sort of driving nature of it, I think a lot of that is helped by the incredible score. The score of this movie is just remarkable. Although, I went back and listened to all of the nominees for Best Original Score the other week just to sort of be like, is it going to be Oppenheimer? I have to say, I really love the score for Killers of the Flower Moon.
It's great.
I'm sure we'll get into that, but that is also a fantastic score. But yeah, the only thing I really want to say though is that, because you alluded to this, is the female characters, and Nolan obviously has a problem writing women, and I'm not going to sit here and say that that's not the case, but I do think that the female characters in this are certainly better than they've been in the past, and while still flawed, I mean, at least this movie doesn't suffer from the dead wife syndrome of the Nolan movie. It suffers from dead girlfriend.
Well,
but,
don't speak too soon on that.
Which, yeah, but I there was something about Katie Oppenheimer, and they talked about it last night in the awards. The scene at the end where she gives this cold heart stare to this man who basically railroaded her husband. There was a power in Emily Blunt's performance that and maybe it's just because I really, really like her as an actress.
She's very good.
I found her performance to be very, very strong. Maybe not the strongest of the year, but certainly worth that nomination. So that's maybe the only one that I would have liked to have gone differently. But yeah, what can I say? As I said, this movie it was everything I wanted it to be. Talk about going in with high expectations. It was everything I wanted it to be. I saw it multiple times. I loved it every time. I think the interesting thing, and we sort of discussed this, and we're not going to get into it because we don't want this to be a 3-hour Christopher Nolan episode, but when I left the theater, my cousin said, where would you rank it in your Nolan rankings? Mm-hmm. And I said, I don't know how to rank it because it is so unlike anything else he's ever done. You know, it is effectively a traditional biopic, but with a Christopher Nolan structure. And the rest of his movies aren't that. They're comic book movies or thrillers or movies about magicians who are trying to kill each other. Like they're not
that classic genre.
Yeah, or they're a veiled James Bond movie that because the Broccoli's won't let him make one. Like, he doesn't do movies like this. So for me, it's really hard to place it along. You know, you alluded to this with the Emma Stone, Lily Gladstone of it all. It's like comparing apples to oranges. This, to me, is very much an apple to orange situation. But I do think this is a masterpiece, and I am very, very glad that it did well, even if it's, you know, maybe the obvious choice. I ended last night very, very happy to see this movie get the plaudits that I do think it rightfully deserves.
Fair enough. I mean, a lot of people agree with you, so it's hard to argue with that.
How about you, Nate? That brings us to your number one pick. What is your number one film of the year?
Yeah, so I was sort of surprised by my pick in some ways after I saw it, and then the fact that it sort of endured in this position. But Killers of the Flower Moon really stuck with me. And wow. I think part of it is that in some ways I see it as almost this parallel movie to Oppenheimer, in that you have these two directors that are really known for one specific thing, right? And I feel like Scorsese's obviously done a lot of different things, but I think that most people think of him as a crime movie guy. And sometimes that's more in the sort of mobster vein. Sometimes it's more in the Wolf of Wall Street vein. But it's these stories of these flawed men who get sort of seduced by power and glamour and money and women and other things, and then become bad people who have tragic endings typically, right? Or they get away with it, and that's tragic in its own way for all of us. That's the way the world works, right? And what I find so fascinating about Killers of the Flower Moon is that it's taking his obsessions, just like Oppenheimer's taking some of Nolan's obsessions, and translating it into a new context. And so in this movie, it is in many ways a mobster movie, right? You have Leonardo DiCaprio, one of his favorite leading men, once again being seduced into the system of corruption. It just so happens that this time the system of corruption is white supremacy and colonialism, and the way that affects the Osage people, and like, I think that that's such an interesting translation. You know, some of the sort of criticism of this movie is that it's not more from the Osage perspective. I think, you know, if Martin Scorsese is going to make this movie, I don't really want him to make that movie because I don't think that he's the right person to do that. I think he's the right person to make this movie, which is about the sort of like, why does this corruption, this evil exist, and why does it persist? And I think that he has done a good job of sort of expressing that. The flip side of that is that he has also let a lot of other people into his creative process and has shaped the script, shaped the sort of the actual on-set experience to make it more true to Osage culture, and also to sort of depict the whole system of that time and place in great detail. And that's my argument for the length of the thing, is that it spends a lot of time, almost like a science fiction movie, immersing you in the way this society is structured, the relationships between the settlers and the Osage, and the rules of the game, and how everything is connected, and all of that. And I think that's without that, I don't know if he could have done such a complete job of such a what am I trying to say? I don't know that he could have done honor to the task that was ahead of him in terms of really digging into what it's all about. So I think that's what fascinated me so much about the movie. And then of course, again, like the craft is all there, right? It's like, it's a great looking movie.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. For considering that it is so long, I do think it's quite well paced. It's slow. It's like, you're right that Oppenheimer moves, right? And it's constantly keeping you on your toes, and each scene has a lot of like energy to it. And by contrast, I think Killers of the Flower Moon is a very slow moving movie, but it's always kind of drifting along. And I think it has a beautiful pace. It's just a very different kind of pace. And of course, like, you know, I'd be remiss to not mention that like Lily Gladstone is incredible in it. Absolutely earned the nomination, and again, would have been so happy to see her win that as well. She is very much the heart of that movie. You know, I love De Niro. I like Leo, but I don't think it's actually their best roles. I think that they're both fine in it, but they're both kind of just doing their thing. You know, Leonardo DiCaprio is looking as toady as possible. And
I again, I haven't seen the full movie, but like within the first 20 minutes, I just was so put off by his performance. It felt so affectatious and so like, I'm like, what is he doing? Like De Niro is sort of just, he's kind of doing like old De Niro, but I was sort of surprised by how much I disliked not the character that DiCaprio was playing, but the choices DiCaprio was making to play the character. It didn't feel like, again, talk about like not reining it in, or, you know, it felt like he was sort of, no one was telling him no, and he was just going, you know, overboard.
Yeah, big in a bad way, where it's not audacious. It's just too much for the character a little bit. I would agree with that. I think that's one of the weaker parts is just Leonardo DiCaprio's performance. But I will say the scenes between him and Lily Gladstone, I think, are quite good, and I think, but she's doing the heavy lifting in some ways, and the contrast between them is really lovely because she is so still and subtle and assured, and he is so intensely sort of like manic and scheming and always trying to make a joke, or, you know, like, so I think, you know, the scene where they're in the house and she sort of urges him to just be quiet and listen to the rain is like a perfect encapsulation of it.
Yeah, totally.
So I think it's incredible. I think that you haven't gotten to the ending, but it has a really bold ending that I'm sure put a lot of people off. I think it really works.
Well, if you want to discuss it, we'll put a spoiler alert here, you know, fast forward. In fact, I will make it in I'll add a little chapter marker so you can immediately skip past the spoilers, but
sure.
You feel free to spoil it for me, Nate, because I have a 2.5-year-old. I do not know when I'm going to find the time to finish this movie.
Well, so I'll try to take about a minute. So skip ahead a minute now if you don't want to hear the spoilers. But at the end of the movie, Martin Scorsese himself appears on screen, much in the spirit of Marty DiBergi, the sort of old school Martin Scorsese, The Last Waltz, like being seen. It's got that sort of energy. Essentially, it skips forward in time, and you see a radio show that's telling the story of these murders, because essentially this story was used as propaganda for the FBI to talk about how great they are. And Martin Scorsese is the guy in the radio show selling this propaganda, and it's
interesting.
So it's like a really bold statement that is also really enigmatic and hard to kind of figure out exactly what he's saying with it, but it really makes you think, and it is beautifully done. It doesn't feel tacked on. It feels very much part of the story, and it's beautifully shot, and he delivers it pretty well. So I think it's interesting. It's kind of in the spirit almost of like the ending of the Black Klansman. It's the same kind of like flash forward through time of like the way the story resonates through history and all of that. So yeah, I think I loved it. I thought it really, really worked. I would say the movie should have an intermission.
I was just gonna say you saw it. You were very, very lucky in that you're one of the few people I know who actually got to see it in a theater. And if I'm not mistaken, you got to see it in an absolutely beautiful movie palace. If I'm not mistaken,
that's right. In I believe Oakland, California, and it was like, again, when I was in the theater, I didn't even notice the time passing. It flew by. It did not feel like a whatever it is 3.5 hour movie. But it's just like biologically, it would make sense to have an intermission in the middle of it to tell people when to pee so that they can come back and focus on the movie, and they're not peeing in the middle of some important scene and missing the thing that you want them to see and hear. So like, I just think it's a courtesy thing. But I don't mind the length. I love long movies.
Yes, you have a much higher tolerance for long movies than I do, but I will say that, again, I didn't finish the movie, so I can't dispute anything you're saying. But one of the things I was really struck by was the sound design. I watched the first hour or so. My wife was sleeping in the same room, so I watched it with my headphones on. But in a weird way, it allowed me to actually really hear the sort of soundscape that was being built up, in addition to the incredible score by the late Robbie Robertson. And I was really, really sort of struck by it. I found, the things that I came away from it thinking was like, damn, this movie sounds incredible and it looks incredible. Yeah. I mean, the cinematography of it, again, very, very different from what they're doing in Oppenheimer, but there is no doubt that this is a beautiful, beautiful movie, visually speaking anyway. Certainly what is happening in the movie is anything but beautiful, but okay, well, I mean, look, if it were to go back into theaters at some point, I will. That seems like it's the way to see it.
Absolutely,
but,
absolutely,
and not at home in several small chunks. But like I said, I got a 2.5-year-old. It's 3.5 hours. That's a big ask these days.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, earlier you asked like
this is the guy who went and saw Oppenheimer 3 times.
Yeah,
so
right.
like maybe me. What am I talking about? Like.
Yeah, I mean, you asked what one of my like favorite experiences in the movie theater was this year, and I didn't want to spoil it since this was my pick for number one, but this was also a pretty incredible experience of just being in a movie theater that really reminds you about like the long history of cinema, and seeing a really epic movie on the big screen was really just like, as you said, reminded me about like why I love movies and why I always want to be going back with a big bucket of popcorn and seeing what they have to offer. All right, Adam. Well, before we wrap up, I do have a little game that I'd like to play with you, just to bring it back.
Ooh, I love a game.
Yeah, bring it back to The Simpsons. Since this is, after all, a podcast about movies and The Simpsons. So I have taken the liberty of adding all of the movies that have been nominated for Best Picture into our database so that I could compare them to the movies that are parodied on The Simpsons and learn a little bit about like what's the relationship between The Simpsons and the Oscars. So big picture, what I found is that about half of all of the Best Picture winners from 1928 to 2002 have been parodied on The Simpsons in some way.
Wow.
So, which is interesting because, like, actually, if you look at, say, like the AFI list, The Simpsons has actually parodied more of the AFI list than the Best Picture winners. I don't know exactly what that means.
Interesting.
But it is kind of interesting.
Well, I guess the interesting thing is that, like, the AFI list is sort of a contemporary reflection on film history and what has stood the test of time, whereas the Academy Awards is always of the year the films were released. And famously, like, we can all count the number of times I alluded to, before, the times when they got it wrong.
Right.
When The Artist wins Best Picture,
right.
A movie that has anybody watched that movie since it came out, or, The King's Speech. I mean, I feel like there was a period in the mid 2000s where they were really not nailing it, but yeah, like, so it kind of does make sense that they would parody the stuff in the AFI list, because those are the movies that have stood the test of time, not necessarily the movies that just happen to win Best Picture. So that stat does kind of make sense to me.
Yeah, totally. And I think I looked at the AFI list itself, and I think about 45% of those movies are Oscar winners, so slightly less than the Simpsons parody. So
right.
Anyway, so
interesting.
Kind of interesting. And then once you get out of the best picture category, it drops off like dramatically. So like I put the best actor winners in just for the sake of comparison. The Simpsons have only actually parodied about 29% of those movies. So
interesting. Okay.
They definitely are trying to be to reference things that people are going to get, right, and that are culturally significant. And the reality is, like you said, a lot of those movies, they don't really stick, right? It may have been a great performance that year, but it just doesn't stick in the public consciousness. So the game I'd like to play with you, Adam, is I've divided all of these up by decades. And I want you to guess what decade of Oscar Best Picture winners do you think The Simpsons reference the most? So from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or 2000s.
Okay. Now, caveat. Does this count? So, for example, we know that Citizen Kane has come up a lot, or Star Wars has come up a lot, or so is this just the number of times total that is referenced, or like does Citizen Kane count once for that decade?
So it counts by the total number of references, not the number of movies.
Jesus, okay.
And if there's ever a tie, I break it by the number of movies that were referenced from that list of 10.
Okay, well, my gut wants to say, based on this is tricky. Based on what we've covered on the show, my gut is instantly leaning into like the 60s, 70s, but I also know where the sort of like top 3, top 5 actually exist, and therefore that should push them higher. So therefore,
remember Oscar Best Picture winners.
Oh, that's true as well, right? Because Citizen Kane famously did not win Best Picture, and I don't think the Wizard of Oz. I don't know. Oh boy. Okay. Well, I'm still. With that being said, I'm gonna go back in time, and I'm gonna say that the 1930s is at the top.
Oh, no. You didn't get it. Do you have a second guess?
But 40s?
Nope. You're going in the right direction.
We're doing real well. Great. Okay. Then the 1960s.
Nope.
70s?
It's the 70s. Jesus. The 70s.
Okay, so my actual initial gut reference or gut instinct was correct.
Yes, the 1970s.
Okay, that makes sense.
You should go with your gut. So yes, the 1970s have 49 total references to Best Picture winners. The Simpsons referenced 8 out of 10 movies that won that decade. The number one most referenced Best Picture winner of that decade,
it's going to be The Godfather.
The
obviously.
Godfather,
yeah, okay.
Of course.
Yeah,
one of the most referenced movies on The Simpsons in general,
and that's obviously what pushed it to the top of this list. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But interestingly, and I found this very, very interesting. There are a couple movies from this decade that won Best Picture that are not referenced on The Simpsons. Annie Hall never referenced on The Simpsons. And
not within our limits.
Within our limits,
because there's
first 13 seasons.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Because I was going to say, I know that there is a reference in one of the later seasons, so that's why. But yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
And Kramer versus Kramer also not parodied on The Simpsons. Interestingly, that one feels like it has some potential. All right. Well, could you order the remaining decades?
Oh Jesus! Okay.
In terms of most,
because I did such a good job. Because I did such a good job last time. Okay, well,
here. How about this? I will give you the list of Best Picture winners, by decade, and that might help you. So, let's see here.
Yeah, that might help me. Okay.
Okay. So let's go. Just ask for a decade, and I'll give it to you.
Well, let's go with the 80s.
with the 80s. Okay, so 80s, we have, in order from earliest to latest, Ordinary People, Chariots of Fire, Gandhi, Terms of Endearment, Amadeus, Out of Africa, Platoon, The Last Emperor, Rain Man, and Driving Miss Daisy.
Okay, so there's like 3 or 4 in there that definitely could, but I'm gonna tentatively put that at like number 5. I think it's probably like the midpoint. That's my so so scratch padding around number 5. If I get it right, you're gonna tell me.
It was number 5.
Oh, wow!
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Look at that.
So 9 total references. As you said, 4 out of 10 movies referenced. The most referenced movie, and this is actually crazy because there aren't that many. The most referenced movie is Terms of Endearment, a James L. Brooks joint.
I was gonna guess. Yeah, James L. Brooks, Sperms of Endearment.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how I always remember it.
It's literally always jokes like that. It's like there is no parody of Terms of Endearment. Missing.
It's just the title parody. Yeah.
Exactly. Missing from the list. For the movies that are never referenced on The Simpsons in our time: Driving Miss Daisy, Platoon, Out of Africa, Amadeus, Gandhi, and Ordinary People. Never.
See, I would have thought Platoon was.
I mean, not that we've seen it, but it would make sense.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that's the problem with like any of those generic Skinner Vietnam flashbacks. It could be any of those Vietnam movies. But
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we've got number 1 and number 5. So let's hear the 60s, please.
All right, the 60s. So the 1960s, we've got The Apartment, West Side Story, Lawrence of Arabia, Tom Jones, My Fair Lady, The Sound of Music, A Man for All Seasons, In the Heat of the Night, Oliver, and Midnight Cowboy.
Okay, so this is going to be number 2. I feel like it has to be.
It's not.
No?
It's not.
Okay, then it's going to be number 3.
The 1960s are number 3 with 19 total references.
Whatever is number 2 must have been the movies were referenced more. Because I feel like this has to be, in terms of like the number of films referenced, this has to be pretty high.
It is, yeah. So 8 out of 10 films referenced.
Okay, well, there you go.
Yeah, 19 total references. The most referenced movie is The Sound of Music with 4 total references.
Okay.
The 2 movies not referenced are In the Heat of the Night, which is maybe not that surprising.
Not surprising knowing what that movie is about.
Right. And The Apartment, which actually like totally could be, stolen as a plot for a Simpsons episode.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, and with the Jack Lemmon of it all.
Exactly.
Okay. Great.
All
so I'm not far. Okay, so number 2 then. What do I think number 2 is? Okay, give me the 1990s.
The 1990s. Okay, so we've got Dances with Wolves, The Silence of the Lambs, Unforgiven, Schindler's List, Forrest Gump, Braveheart, The English Patient, Titanic, Shakespeare in Love, and American Beauty.
Okay, well, based on the fact that we're stopping at season 13, I don't think the 90s is going to be in second place. I think it's going to be low. I think it's going to be. I think it might be at the wait, between 1920. 20 could also be. No, I still think it's going to be bottom. I think it's going to be like 8. Oh,
I'm afraid not, sir. No.
Okay. 9?
Nope.
Higher. Okay, interesting. Wow. So is it number 4, 7, 6?
Keep going
number
up.
6.
Keep
Is
going
it
up.
2?
It's number 2. It's number
What?
2. Yep, believe it or not, it is
I couldn't
number
have.
2.
I couldn't have been more wrong.
Yep.
Wow.
23 total references. They reference 8 out of 10 movies. And the most referenced movie is, can you guess from that list?
Silence of the Lambs?
The Silence of the Lambs, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, there are actually a lot of references to the 90s. But
that's surprising to me.
It is. But I mean, keep in mind that like this is when the show is airing. So like if they want to be topical, it's going to be from the 90s. The two movies that they do not parody, The English Patient and Unforgiven. Which again, I think I've commented on this before. They don't do a lot of Westerns. That's like the one genre that they don't really get into very much.
It's almost, well, and we sort of, our thinking is that maybe it's too tropey and too, there's not enough.
Well, unlike science fiction movies and horror movies.
Well, yeah, I don't know, man.
I don't know.
You're the Western expert.
I wonder if they just don't like Westerns because it's like probably the most influential movie that they never ever reference is The Searchers. It's not. It's like on so many lists of like important movies, influential movies, they never ever reference it. Not even in like a shot, like that famous shot looking out the door at the landscape. It wouldn't be hard to parody. They never do it. Go figure.
Yeah. All right. So we've got number 1, 2, 3, and 5. So, and we haven't done. What am I missing so far? So I'm missing the 30s, the 20s. So the 2000s is only going to be 2 years worth, right?
That's
3
right.
years worth.
And when did the Oscars
So that's
start?
got to be 1920. Okay, so I feel like, because on this chart 8 and 9 are tied. So I feel like the 20s and the 2000s are tied for 8 and 9.
That is correct. They are at the very bottom of the list with 0 references.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I mean, the 1920s, Wings, I don't think would be a hot parody subject.
Right. But Broadway Melody, again, it's like plausible that it could be, but it is not. And then in the 2000s, the movies that it does not reference, Chicago, although it does later, A Beautiful Mind, and Gladys.
Okay. Is A Beautiful Mind in the episode where Homer becomes smart? There's no beautiful mind, or is that past?
Don't think so. No, that is in the 13 seasons, but I don't think that there was a reference to A Beautiful Mind. Maybe I'm wrong. It's always possible.
Yeah. Okay. So we got number 4, number 6, and number 7, and I've got to do the 1940s, the 1950s, and
the 30s.
And the 30s. Okay, geez. All right, hit me with the 1950s, because I think that this is going to be high-ish based on. But tell me what they are, and then I'll make my judgment.
All right. So we have All About Eve, An American in Paris, The Greatest Show on Earth, From Here to Eternity, On the Waterfront, Marty, Around the World in 80 Days, The Bridge on the River Kwai, Gigi, and Ben-Hur.
Yeah, I'm going to say that that's number 4.
You nailed it. That is indeed number 4.
Yeah.
So, can you guess though what is the number 1 most parodied movie on that list?
Ben-Hur?
It is Ben-Hur, indeed.
Yeah.
And it's basically the same scene parodied again and again and again and again.
Over and over and over again.
Which is
that one
just the
scene that
chariot
everyone knows from Ben-Hur. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
A movie I have not seen, but knew exactly what the answer was going to be.
Totally. So there's 12 total references to the winners of the 1950s. 4 out of 10 movies referenced. And the missing movies are Gigi, Marty, On the Waterfront, The Greatest Show on Earth, An American in Paris, and All About Eve. None of those are parodied.
Yeah. Okay.
Surprised that On the Waterfront is never parodied.
Yeah, that does feel kind of like an omission, but
a very parodied movie with another Brando performance that who they love to parody. So go figure. All right, 30s and 40s, number 6 and number 7. All right, that's what's left.
Hit me. Well, okay. No. Okay. I don't trust your gut, Scholes. Give me the rundown of both, and then I will make my judgment based on once I know what the titles are, because I don't think I can do it like without knowing.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, so the 1930s. We're going to start at the very earliest. So 1929, 1930, All Quiet on the Western Front, Cimarron, Grand Hotel, Cavalcade, It Happened One Night, Mutiny on the Bounty, The Great Ziegfeld, The Life of Emile Zola, You Can't Take It With You, and Gone with the Wind. That's the 30s.
Okay, so the Gone with the Wind of it all might bump it up, but otherwise I don't think most of those made the cut. So
right.
Okay, and then hit me
1940s.
with the 40s.
Yeah. Rebecca, How Green Was My Valley, Mrs. Miniver, Casablanca, Going My Way, The Lost Weekend, The Best Years of Our Lives, one of my faves, Gentleman's Agreement, Hamlet, and All the King's Men.
I mean, the problem is that Casablanca in there. It's basically at this point, it's what is referenced more, Casablanca or Gone with the Wind. And I'm going to say it's Gone with the Wind. So therefore, I think 30s is 6, 40s is 7. And if I'm wrong, I know it's the other way around. It's the other way around, damn it.
It's the other way around. Number 6 is the 1940s with 9 total references, 6 major references, 3 out of 10 movies referenced, so not that many. Most references indeed Casablanca with 4 references, and missing from The Simpsons, All the King's Men, Hamlet, Gentleman's Agreement, The Best Years of Our Lives, Mrs. Miniver, and How Green Was My Valley, and Rebecca. And number 7 is the 1930s with 9 total references, 3 major references, 2 out of 10 movies referenced, and the most referenced movie, as you called it, Gone with the Wind, with 8 total references. The movies that are not referenced, You Can't Take It With You, The Life of Emile Zola, Great Ziegfeld, Mutiny on the Bounty, It Happened One Night, Cavalcade, Grand Hotel, and Cimarron. So there you have it. So just to give you the full order there, in terms of the decades of Best Picture winners most referenced on The Simpsons, we have the 1970s at number 1, the 1990s at number 2, the 1960s at number 3, the 1950s at number 4, the 1980s at number 5, which surprised me that it's that low, the 1940s at number 6, the 1930s at number 7, and tied for last place the 2000s and the 1920s.
Well, that brings us to the end of this very special non-canonical episode of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpsons fans. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review and share this episode with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. We will be back with our regularly scheduled program very shortly, where we will be tackling a classic of American pastime. It's a baseball movie. It's The Natural. Look, what can I say? I'm Canadian. Baseball doesn't really do anything for me, but we'll see. Maybe we'll be pleasantly surprised. At the very least, we get to look at Robert Redford for 2.5 hours.
There's always that.
And in the meantime, Nate?
In the words of the great editor Jennifer LeMay, gone for, which means good night.
See you around the Plex.
Arrgh! My groin!